Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Let the decisions of the day loosen their hold for a while. The answered ones, the unfinished ones, the small choices that waited in the background while other things asked for you. They do not need to be gathered up again tonight. They can rest where they are without being solved, and the mind can turn towards something older, slower, and no longer asking anything of you. This is the long story of Rome before Byzantium carries the name onward. The story of a city that distrusted kings, shaped a republic out of law and office, drew Italy and then the Mediterranean into its keeping, and slowly became an empire whose Western power changed form until the old imperial court came to rest. If these quiet histories help make the night feel softer, subscribing is a gentle way to keep them near. New chronicles are published each week, and a like helps this calm corner of history find others who may need it. So the history may open with Rome still small, still remembering the danger of a crown, and already learning how power could be divided, named, limited, and made to endure. Chapter 1. The Republic learns its own shape. The Republic began with a refusal that Romans later remembered as the beginning of their liberty. They told the story as the expulsion of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the last king, whose rule had become a warning about what happened when command gathered too tightly in one household. Whether every detail survived from the 6th century BCE exactly as later writers gave it is less important than the use Rome made of the memory, because the hatred of kings became one of the Republic's oldest political instincts. Lucius Junius Brutus stood at the center of that remembered beginning. In Roman tradition, he helped drive out Tarquin after the outrage committed by the royal house against Lucretia, and then became one of the first consuls of the new order. The story was severe in the Roman way, because Brutus was later said to have condemned his own sons when they joined a plot to restore the monarchy. Ancient memory liked such hard examples, and this one taught that public liberty, once won, demanded an obedience colder than family feeling. Instead of one king, Rome placed 2 consuls at the head of the state. Each held authority for a single year, and each could check the other, so that command was powerful in war, but deliberately unstable in possession. Lictors walked before them with bundled rods, and in certain contexts, axes, signs of punishment and command that had belonged to royal power, but now moved with magistrates whose term would end. The symbol remained old, while the office around it had changed. That was a Roman habit from the beginning, to keep the visible form and alter the arrangement beneath it. The Republic did not abolish hierarchy, ceremony, or command. It divided them, timed them, surrounded them with rules, and made memory do political work. The first years after the kings were not serene. Tarquin did not disappear from Roman thought as soon as he left the city, and stories of Lars Porsena, the Etruscan ruler of Clusium, kept alive the fear that monarchy might return with foreign help. Later, Romans told of siege, negotiation, and acts of endurance at the bridge and in the enemy camp. And although the traditions come to us shaped by patriotic memory, they show what Rome wanted to believe about itself. The young Republic was small, exposed, and anxious, but it preferred to remember danger as the school of civic firmness. Inside the city, power still belonged largely to patrician families. They held old priesthoods, controlled much of the knowledge of legal procedure, and filled the early magistracies with names that returned again and again in the public record. The plebeians, who made up the wider body of citizens, served in the army, worked land, paid debts, and bore the weight of public obligations without equal access to public honor. A republic could exist without being generous, and Rome's early order was proof of that. Debt gave the conflict its most personal edge. A citizen who had fought for the city could return to a neglected field, a poor harvest, and an obligation that had continued to grow while he was away. Debt bondage was not an abstract constitutional matter to the men who feared it, because it could touch the body, the household, and the future of children. When Roman tradition described plebeian anger in these years, it did not describe a people outside the state, but citizens asking why service in war had not earned security in peace. The first secession of the plebs, traditionally placed in 494 BCE, gave that anger a form Rome could not ignore. The plebeians withdrew from the city to the Sacred Mount, refusing ordinary cooperation and military service until their grievances were answered. Menenius Agrippa was later said to have spoken to them with the fable of the body and its members, explaining that the stomach, though it seemed idle, nourished the limbs that complained against it. The tale is patrician in its sympathy, yet the result mattered more than the parable, because the plebeians gained officers of their own. Those officers were the tribunes of the plebs. Their persons were made sacrosanct, and their power of intervention gave the plebeian body a means of resisting magistrates. The office did not make Rome equal, but it created a protected channel through which inequality could be contested without tearing the state apart every time pressure gathered. Few things reveal early Rome more clearly than this arrangement, because the city often answered danger not by removing the cause altogether, but by building a new office beside it. The conflict of the orders continued across generations, patient, repetitive, and often technical. Access to magistracies, marriage between patricians and plebeians, debt relief, written law, and the binding force of plebiscites all became part of the slow argument over who possessed the republic. The pace matters. Rome was not transformed by a single generous reform, but by a long sequence of concessions made under pressure, remembered afterward as part of the city's growing wisdom. Cincinnatus belonged to this world of austere public memory. In the traditional account, he was called from his small farm to serve as dictator during a military emergency, took command, resolved the crisis, and returned to his plough after surrendering extraordinary power. The story was polished by later admiration, and it tells us as much about Roman ideals as about the 5th century BCE. Yet its endurance is revealing, because Romans wanted authority to be immense in need and temporary by principle. The dictatorship itself was one of the early republic's more interesting solutions. It allowed concentrated command during emergencies, but only under defined circumstances and for a limited term. In this, as in the consulship, Roman suspicion of kingship did not mean suspicion of power altogether. The republic feared power that could not be recalled. Law became the next field of struggle. Plebeians complained that unwritten custom left them at the mercy of those who knew and interpreted it, especially patrician magistrates and priests. Around the middle of the 5th century BCE, Rome appointed the decemvirs, a board of 10 men, to set the law into written form. The result was the 12 tables, displayed publicly on bronze or another durable material according to later tradition, so that the rules of family, property, debt, injury, inheritance, and procedure could be known beyond the circle of aristocratic memory. The 12 tables were not gentle laws. They belonged to a hard agrarian society in which fathers held wide power, debts could carry severe consequences, and social rank remained visible. Still, writing the law changed its political character because what was posted in public could be cited, argued over, taught, and remembered. A tired modern reader might think first of rights, but for Rome the deeper change lay in publicity. The law had become something the community could see. The decemvirs themselves entered Roman memory as another warning about concentrated authority. Appius Claudius Crassus, the most notorious of them, was associated with arrogance, abuse, and the attempted domination of Virginia, a young woman whose story later Roman writers connected with the fall of the board. As with the story of Lucretia at the fall of the kings, private violation became, in Roman memory, the sign of public corruption. The pattern is uncomfortable but important, because Romans often told political change through the dishonor of households and the collapse of restraint among powerful men. After the decemvirs fell, ordinary magistracies returned, and the written law remained. The Republic had absorbed another crisis by making an institutional gain out of a political failure. This did not make Roman society harmonious. It gave future conflict a more durable framework. Beyond the city, early Rome fought neighboring peoples whose names later became part of the long education of Roman arms. Latins, Aequi, Volsci, Etruscans, and others whose towns stood close enough for war to be seasonal, local, and persistent. The citizen soldier of this early period was not yet the long-service professional of later centuries. He supplied much of his own equipment according to property class, left fields and household obligations behind, and returned to a city where military duty and political standing pressed closely together. The scale was still modest. Early Rome was not yet the marble capital imagined by later empire, but a growing city of hills, walls, shrines, markets, lanes, cattle, smoke from domestic hearths, and fields near enough that politics and agriculture belonged to the same rhythm of life. Its magistrates did not command continents. Its armies did not yet winter along the Rhine or Euphrates. That smallness gives the early institutions their proper weight, because the forms made for a city would one day be stretched over a world. By the 4th century BCE, the Republic had become more than a rejection of monarchy. It had consuls, tribunes, assemblies, priesthoods, a senate of aristocratic weight, written laws, emergency offices, and a civic memory filled with examples of danger and restraint. These arrangements were uneven and often harsh, but they trained Romans to think of public life as something made through offices, precedents, oaths, and negotiated pressure. The city did not yet know the Mediterranean, but it had already begun to develop the habits by which it would meet it. The most lasting of those habits was not kindness, and it was not fairness in any simple sense. It was the capacity to preserve conflict inside forms that could endure. Patricians and plebeians did not cease to struggle. Commanders did not cease to seek honor. Debt did not cease to trouble the poor, and old families did not willingly surrender advantage. Yet the Republic kept finding ways to turn pressure into procedure, and procedure into memory, until Rome's public life acquired a density that later generations could treat almost as inheritance. So the first Roman Republic was neither the pure liberty imagined by admirers nor the closed aristocracy described by its harshest critics. It was a small, ambitious, anxious community, learning how to distrust kings while still needing command, how to admit common citizens into the structure without dissolving aristocratic power, and how to make written law serve a society that remained deeply unequal. Out of those compromises came the early Roman state, still local in reach, still rough in texture, but already carrying the strange durability that would allow it to lose, adjust, remember, and continue. That strange durability would soon face its first great shock, testing whether the habits of compromise could survive the near-total destruction of the city itself. Chapter 2. After the sack, Italy becomes Roman. The Gallic sack entered Roman memory as a humiliation so large that later generations placed it among the city's deepest lessons. Around 390 BCE, according to the traditional chronology, a force of Gauls under a leader remembered as Brennus defeated the Romans near the river Allia and entered the city itself. Ancient accounts preserved the event through scenes of fear, ransom, and stubborn survival. And although the details were shaped by retelling, the wound remained politically useful. Rome learned to remember itself as a city that had once been occupied and had then returned to its work. Marcus Furius Camillus stood in that memory as the restorer. Later Romans credited him with rescuing the city from the Gauls and opposing any proposal to abandon Rome for the captured Etruscan city of Veii. The story gave Rome a second founder, not at the beginning of time, but after disaster, when the choice was whether to remain attached to a damaged place. What mattered most was the lesson carried forward. Defeat did not cancel the city's claim on its future. After the sack, Roman policy hardened around defense, rebuilding, and renewed expansion. The city's walls were strengthened, military organization continued to develop, and Rome's dealings with neighboring communities became more systematic. A small state could be wounded by one battle, but a state that bound allies to itself could draw on more men, more roads, more fields, and more obligations. The recovery was therefore not only emotional or architectural, it was institutional. Italy in the 4th century BCE was not waiting to become Roman. The peninsula held Latin towns, Etruscan cities, Greek colonies in the south, hill peoples, pastoral communities, and federations whose local loyalties were old and serious. Rome's rise took place among them rather than above them at first, and the wars that followed were often close, repetitive, and difficult to settle finally. The later map of Roman Italy can make conquest look inevitable, but to the people living inside those generations, it arrived as a series of hard bargains and unfinished contests. The Latin War of the 4th century BCE revealed how dangerous Rome's nearest relationships could become. Latin communities had fought beside Rome, shared language and cult, and belonged to a network of obligations that had grown over time. But closeness did not mean obedience. When Rome defeated the Latin League, it did not apply one simple punishment to all. Some towns received citizenship, some received limited rights, some remained allies under treaty, and some were reshaped by confiscation or settlement. This unevenness was not accidental. It became one of Rome's most effective instruments. A Roman alliance rarely meant equality. It meant a place within a hierarchy whose terms could differ from town to town, and that difference made united resistance more difficult. One community might possess voting rights, another private legal rights without full political voice, another a treaty requiring soldiers but preserving local magistrates. Such arrangements may sound dry, but they formed the quiet machinery of conquest. Rome did not need every Italian to become Roman at once. It needed each community to have a reason, or a compulsion, to stand slightly apart from its neighbor. The Samnite Wars pulled Rome into a harsher inland world. The Samnites lived among the Apennine highlands of central and southern Italy, where valleys, ridges, narrow routes, and fortified places made campaigning different from war on the Latium plain. Roman armies had to learn from failure there, because the terrain did not flatter rigid assumptions. The disaster at the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, where a Roman army was trapped and forced to pass under the yoke, remained another memory of shame, less famous than the Gallic sack, but still severe enough to teach caution. From such contests came adaptation. Rome changed formations, extended operations, planted colonies, and learned to connect military pressure with settlement policy. A colony was not merely a distant group of households, it was a Roman answer to distance. Placed on strategic land, inhabited by citizens or Latins, tied to roads and obligations, it gave the Republic a human and legal presence where an army could not stand every day. A map of these settlements would show conquest not as a single advancing line, but as a pattern of knots drawn tighter across the peninsula. Appius Claudius Caecus gave that pattern one of its most durable physical forms. As censor in 3112 BCE, he sponsored the Via Appia, the great road running south from Rome toward Capua, and also associated his name with an aqueduct that brought water into the city. The road's packed layers, paving stones, drainage, and directness turned political intention into something wheels, feet, hooves, and marching columns could use. It is one of the useful truths of Roman history that power often became visible first as infrastructure. Appius was also remembered as a man of aristocratic force and political boldness. His censorship was associated with changes to the Senate list and with the registration of citizens in ways that unsettled older patterns. Later tradition made him a severe figure, blind in old age, still capable of speaking when Pyrrhus's envoy urged Rome to make peace. Whether every word belongs to history or to memory, the shape of the figure is consistent. Appius represented a Roman confidence that roads, offices, and public speech could all extend the state. By the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, Rome's wars with the Samnites widened into struggles involving Etruscans, Umbrians, Gauls, and other peoples. The Battle of Sentinum in 295 BCE later stood as one of the decisive moments, because Rome faced a coalition whose defeat helped secure its movement toward dominance in central Italy. The details of command, sacrifice, and battlefield tradition were polished by Roman writers, but the consequence was plain enough. After Sentinum, Rome's reach no longer looked like a local Latin matter. Southern Italy brought a different challenge. Greek cities such as Tarentum belonged to the wider Hellenistic world, and their politics drew Rome into contact with kingship of a more Eastern and theatrical kind. Pyrrhus of Epirus arrived in Italy in 280 BCE with professional soldiers, cavalry, and elephants, carrying the prestige of a commander connected to the age after Alexander. To Roman eyes, his army must have represented something both foreign and formidable, though the sources are more interested in moral contrast than in wonder. Pyrrhus won battles at Heraclea and Asculum, but victory did not give him what he needed. Roman losses were heavy, yet Rome continued to raise men, refuse settlement on humiliating terms, and draw strength from its Italian system. Pyrrhus is said to have recognized the terrible cost of defeating such an opponent, and his name later became attached to victory that consumes the victor's strength. The phrase has lasted because the situation was so clear: Rome could lose a battle and remain politically alive. Gaius Fabricius Licinius entered the Roman tradition as the answer to Hellenistic elegance. Stories described him as poor, incorruptible, and unmoved by Pyrrhus's gifts or threats, a man whose virtue lay in refusing the temptations that foreign monarchies seemed to offer. These accounts have the clean edges of moral anecdote, but they reveal how Romans liked to arrange the contrast. Against gold, elephants, kings, and refined speech, they placed the stern citizen and the stubborn Senate. The war with Pyrrhus ended with Rome's influence confirmed across southern Italy. Tarentum submitted, Greek cities adjusted to Roman power, and the Republic stood for the first time as the dominant force throughout the peninsula. Yet dominance did not mean that Italy had become uniform. Local languages, customs, elites, cults, and memories remained, while Roman treaties and obligations settled over them in layers. The result was not a nation in the modern sense, but a military and political system strong enough to act as one when Rome called. This system gave Rome a reservoir of manpower that astonished its enemies. Allies supplied troops, local aristocrats found advantage in cooperation, and colonies guarded routes that armies could use. The obligations were burdensome, but they were also structured, predictable, and tied to local status. Rome's gift was not generosity. It was the ability to make subordination feel organized enough to endure. The triumph became one of the ceremonies through which these victories entered Roman public life. A successful commander might pass through the city with captives, spoils, painted images of conquered places, and the signs of military favor, while the community watched foreign war become civic memory. Captured standards, weapons, and treasure did more than decorate success. They taught Romans to see expansion as part of the city's own story, a story that belonged in streets, temples, and family names. In these same generations, roads made distance more manageable. The Via Appia did not merely carry armies south. It encouraged a Roman habit of thinking through lines, routes, and maintained surfaces. A road required labor, stone, surveying, and repair, and in return it gave the state a repeated path through land that might otherwise remain local in feeling. Every journey along it made Roman order slightly more ordinary. By 264 BCE, when Rome first crossed into the affairs of Sicily and began the movement toward war with Carthage, it had already undergone a transformation as great as many later conquests. It had survived invasion, disciplined its near allies, fought long wars in the mountains, planted colonies, built roads, defeated a Hellenistic king, and drawn most of Italy into its military orbit. The Republic still spoke the language of a city-state, but its resources had ceased to be merely urban. What had changed most was the relationship between Roman citizenship, allied obligation, and war. A farmer in a Latin colony, an aristocrat in a once independent town, a Roman senator and an allied infantryman might all stand at different distances from full Roman power, yet the system could gather them into the same campaign. That layered arrangement was difficult, unequal, and often resented. It was also the reason Rome could keep fighting after losses that would have ended a looser coalition. The story of Italy becoming Roman is therefore not only a story of battle, it is a story of categories: citizen, Latin, ally, colony, municipium, treaty partner, confiscated land, military road, census class, voting tribe. These were the quieter instruments by which victory remained after the army moved on. The Republic had learned that conquest lasted when it could be written into status, obligation, and habit. At the end of this Italian century, Rome stood at the edge of a larger sea. The city that had once feared Etruscan kings and Gallic raiders now possessed an alliance system strong enough to challenge powers beyond Italy. Its senators did not yet know what the struggle with Carthage would demand, or how deeply Mediterranean empire would alter the republic that acquired it. But the foundations had been laid in roads, colonies, treaties, and the patient Roman willingness to turn every settlement into another form of command. The structures of command built across the Italian soil now demanded a navy to match them, shifting the Roman mind from the logic of the road to the uncertain discipline of the sea. Chapter 3: Roads, Ships, and the Mediterranean Burden. A boarding bridge on the deck of a Roman warship was an awkward answer to a problem the Republic had not expected to face so soon. Rome had become powerful by land, through roads, colonies, treaties, and the slow binding of Italian manpower, but Carthage belonged to the sea in a way Rome did not. Its harbors, merchants, naval crews, and western Mediterranean settlements rested on generations of maritime habit. When the struggle over Sicily drew the two powers into war in 264 BCE, Rome entered a field where courage and discipline were not enough, because ships had to be built, crews had to be trained, and command had to learn a different element. The First Punic War began over Messana, a Sicilian city whose local crisis became the doorway to a much larger contest. Sicily was too close to Italy for Rome to ignore, and too central to Carthaginian interests for Carthage to abandon easily. The island held Greek cities, Carthaginian strongholds, fertile land, and harbors that made it valuable far beyond its size. Rome's decision to intervene carried the Republic across the narrow water between Italy and Sicily, and with that crossing, the Italian power began to become a Mediterranean power. At first, the Romans lacked the naval inheritance that Carthage possessed. Later tradition said they copied a captured Carthaginian ship, and whether the account is exact or simplified, it preserves a real Roman pattern. When faced with a technical deficiency, the Republic tried to convert imitation into discipline. The corvus, the boarding bridge associated with early Roman fleets, allowed soldiers to grip an enemy vessel and fight more like infantry. It was a practical device, and also a revealing one, because Rome tried to make naval battle resemble land battle closely enough for its existing strengths to matter. The price of learning was high. Fleets were lost not only in combat, but in storms, where crowded ships, inexperienced seamanship, and Mediterranean weather could undo months of public expense. A warship was not merely wood and bronze, it was trained hands, public money, allied labor, and the confidence of families who had sent men into a service Rome was still learning to understand. Naval defeat, therefore, carried a different weight from the loss of a field army, because rebuilding meant returning to shipyards, treasuries, and harbors before victory could be attempted again. Still, the Republic endured the arithmetic of loss. The war stretched for more than 20 years, and its length taught Rome to think beyond the seasonal rhythm of Italian campaigning. In 241 BCE, the Roman victory near the Aegates Islands forced Carthage to accept defeat, abandon Sicily, and pay a heavy indemnity. The sum was counted in talents, a unit whose ancient weight can feel remote, but the meaning was plain enough to the treasuries that had to supply it. Rome had won its first province, and in doing so had accepted responsibilities that no older Italian alliance had required. Sicily changed the Republic's habits. It was not an allied Italian community with a negotiated place in the Roman system, but a territory governed for Roman purposes, taxed in grain, watched by magistrates, and held across the sea. Administration had to follow victory, and the old city-state language of consul, senate, and people now had to stretch over provincial command. This is one of the quiet turns in Roman history, because empire often begins not with a declaration, but with the ordinary question of who collects the grain after the army has gone. Carthage did not cease to matter after the First War. Hamilcar Barca, who had fought in Sicily and then turned towards Spain, helped lay the foundations for a revived Carthaginian position in the west. Spain offered silver, manpower, and distance from the immediate shadow of Rome, and the Barcid family built there with a freedom that made Roman suspicion grow. Hannibal Barca inherited more than a command. He inherited a memory of defeat, a western base, and a political world in which Rome and Carthage could no longer pretend their interests would remain separate. The Second Punic War began in 218 BCE after Hannibal's attack on Saguntum and his decision to carry war into Italy by land. His march from Spain through southern Gaul and across the Alps became one of the most enduring military episodes of antiquity, not because it was picturesque, but because it altered the scale of what Rome had to fear. Hannibal brought Africans, Iberians, Gauls, cavalry, infantry, and elephants through a passage that cost him heavily before he ever reached the plain of northern Italy. By the time he descended, his army had already become a political message. Carthage could place danger inside Italy itself. Hannibal's early victories came with a terrible clarity. At Trebia and Lake Trasimene, Roman armies suffered defeats that exposed impatience, poor judgment, and the difficulty of facing a commander who understood terrain and timing with unusual skill. The disaster at Cannae in 216 BCE went further. There, a large Roman force was enveloped and destroyed in a battle that later military writers studied for its terrible completeness, while Rome itself absorbed the loss of senators, magistrates, allied contingents, and family lines. In households across the Republic, public defeat became private absence. After Cannae, many states would have asked what terms could be obtained. Rome did not. The Senate refused to ransom some prisoners, continued recruitment, limited public mourning, and held to the belief that endurance could become policy. This was not calm courage in any sentimental sense. It was a hard communal discipline made possible by institutions, pride, fear, allied obligations, and the knowledge that surrender to Hannibal might unravel the whole Italian system. The Republic had already learned in Italy how to survive defeat without conceding the future, and now it applied that lesson on a much larger field. Fabius Maximus became the name attached to that endurance. His strategy avoided direct confrontation with Hannibal when direct confrontation had become ruinous, and it relied instead on delay, harassment, watched roads, guarded supplies, and the steady refusal to give the Carthaginian commander the decisive settlement he needed. Romans who valued aggressive honor found this difficult to admire at first. Yet the Fabian method recognized something that excitement rarely understands. An army living inside hostile country can win battles and still fail to win the war if time, food, allies, and replacement men move against it. Hannibal remained in Italy for years, and that long presence tested the loyalty of Rome's allies. Some communities defected, most famously Capua, whose choice carried symbolic and strategic weight. Others remained with Rome, whether from calculation, fear, local rivalry, treaty habit, or belief in Roman recovery. The layered system built during the conquest of Italy now faced its severest examination. It did not hold perfectly, but it held enough. Meanwhile, the war widened. Spain became a major theatre, and there Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, began the career that would turn Rome's defensive endurance into offensive possibility. He captured New Carthage in 209 BCE, gaining a harbour, supplies, hostages, and prestige in a single operation whose consequences reached beyond the city walls. His treatment of Spanish hostages, carefully remembered by later writers, belonged to the politics of conquest as much as to personal character. Scipio eventually carried the war to North Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy. The movement reversed the emotional direction of the conflict. For years, Romans had lived with Hannibal in their peninsula, a pressure that never fully lifted even when he was far from the city. Now Carthage faced Roman command near its own heart, and the Battle of Zama in 22 BCE decided the war. Hannibal's veterans and Scipio's army met in a struggle whose later fame belonged not to spectacle, but to consequence. Carthage survived as a city, but not as Rome's equal. The settlement after Zama stripped Carthage of fleet, territory, independence in foreign policy, and much of the power that had made it dangerous. Rome received indemnity and recognition of supremacy in the Western Mediterranean, while Scipio received a surname that joined his identity to Africa. Yet victory over Carthage did not bring rest. It opened the Republic further to Spain, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean, where older kingdoms, Greek cities, and dynastic conflicts now entered the Senate's field of vision. The Eastern Wars changed Roman culture in quieter ways than the Punic Wars, but their effects ran deep. Macedon and the Seleucid Kingdom were not enemies like Carthage, shaped by a long Western rivalry, but heirs to the Hellenistic world that had followed Alexander. Roman armies entered lands filled with Greek cities, royal courts, libraries, temples, statues, diplomats, and philosophical traditions older than Roman power. The conquest of Greece and the defeat of Eastern kings brought treasure and prestige, but they also brought comparison, and comparison is one of conquest's subtler burdens. Greek art, books, tutors, physicians, and captives entered Roman households. Public buildings and private villas began to display objects taken from cities whose cultural authority Rome could defeat but not easily dismiss. Cato the Elder worried over Greek influence with the severity of a man who believed Rome's older discipline could be softened by luxury and eloquence. His anxiety was not merely prejudice. It registered a real change in the Republic, because empire was carrying foreign wealth into the habits of the ruling class. The destruction of Carthage in 1406 BCE in the Third Punic War gave Roman fear its final answer. Carthage had already been reduced, but Roman suspicion endured, urged on by voices such as Cato's, who repeatedly pressed for its removal. When the city fell after siege, Rome eliminated the old rival whose name had shaped more than a century of policy. In the same year, Corinth was destroyed in Greece, and the coincidence became a dark marker of Roman command. The Western rival and a great Greek city both brought under Roman severity. Violence on that scale should not be lingered over for its own sake. Its importance lies in what followed. Rome now possessed influence and territory across a wide Mediterranean world, and the Senate became the place where embassies, indemnities, kings, provinces, military commands, and commercial interests converged. A political system designed for a city and its Italian alliances now received the business of many peoples. The Republic had not become administratively gentle just because it had become powerful. Wealth altered the countryside as well as the Senate. Large estates expanded, often worked by enslaved labor brought through conquest, while smaller citizens could find themselves pressured by debt, absence in military service, and competition with owners who possessed more capital and more influence. The old picture of the sturdy citizen farmer did not vanish all at once, but it became harder to sustain as a social foundation. Rome's victories had filled the city with goods, captives, contracts, and opportunities, and those benefits did not settle evenly. A triumph in these years might show the scale of change more clearly than any law. Captured armor, paintings of foreign places, chained prisoners, gold, silver, and carved images passed before Roman crowds, turning distant wars into public spectacle. The ceremony honored a commander, thanked the gods, and taught the people what their city had acquired. Yet behind the display stood a more complicated fact. Every conquest created commands, temptations, resentments, fortunes, and inequalities that returned to Rome with the victorious army. By the later 2nd century BCE, the Republic was richer and less stable than it had been before the Punic Wars. Its aristocrats competed on a wider stage. Its armies served farther from home. Its provinces required governors who could be honorable or predatory, and its citizens lived inside an economy increasingly shaped by conquest. The Senate still deliberated in the language of ancestral custom, but the pressures before it had changed in size. A small constitutional vocabulary was being asked to govern a very large world. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, who would soon become one of the most disputed men in Roman history, belonged to this aftermath. His concerns about land, military service, and the condition of citizens were not separate from Rome's Mediterranean victories. They were among the domestic consequences of those victories. The Republic had defeated Carthage, humbled kings, and entered Greece, but it had not solved the question of how a conquering state preserved the social body that made conquest possible. That question would move from private concern to public crisis with gathering force. So the Mediterranean entered the Senate House not only as territory, tribute, and fame, but as strain. It came in the form of provincial commands, Greek statues, enslaved labor, Spanish silver, North African memory, ambitious generals, displaced farmers, and public arguments over what Rome owed its own citizens. The Republic had learned to cross water, defeat a rival empire, and command old kingdoms. It had not yet learned how to remain itself after doing so. This internal contradiction, where victory abroad created ruin at home, settled upon the political structure in the form of a land crisis that demanded a radical and bloody response. Chapter 4: Reform, Command, and the Republic against itself. Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus entered Roman public life at a moment when conquest had made the Republic larger than its older social arrangements could easily bear. He came from one of the noblest families in Rome, with a father remembered for service and a mother, Cornelia, honored in later tradition as the daughter of Scipio Africanus and as an image of aristocratic seriousness. His rank mattered, because his challenge to the Senate did not come from the margins of Roman society. It came from within the ruling order itself, from a man who believed that Rome's victories had begun to weaken the citizen body on which those victories depended. The problem gathered around public land, though the land question carried many other questions inside it. Rome had acquired territory through war, and portions of that land, the Ager Publicus, were supposed to remain under public ownership even when wealthy men occupied and worked large parts of it. Older limits on occupation had been neglected, and estates grew while many smaller citizens struggled under debt, military absence, and competition from enslaved labor. The matter was legal, economic, and military at once, because a farmer who lost his property might also lose the status that made him liable and able to serve in the traditional levy. In 130 BCE, as tribune of the plebs, Tiberius proposed to enforce limits on the occupation of public land and redistribute portions to poorer citizens. The measure was not, in its basic terms, a social revolution. It claimed to restore an older legal boundary that elite practice had eroded. Yet the politics around it became severe, because property, prestige, senatorial authority, and the tribune's power all met in the same proposal. A law could be old in principle and still feel dangerous when someone finally tried to apply it. The confrontation with Marcus Octavius, another tribune, gave the crisis its constitutional shape. Octavius used his veto against the land bill, and Tiberius responded by asking the popular assembly to remove him from office. To supporters, this made sense because a tribune who blocked the people's interest had betrayed the office he held. To opponents, it violated the sacred protection of magistracy and turned popular will into a weapon against constitutional restraint. Rome had lived for centuries by balancing powers against each other, and now one of those balances was being forced open. Tiberius' death on the Capitoline marked a change that Romans could not easily undo. During a tense public gathering, senatorial opponents, led by men who claimed to be defending the state, moved against him and his followers with improvised force. The killing was not battlefield violence brought back in memory, but political violence inside the city, among citizens, at the heart of public decision. Afterward, Rome still had assemblies, magistrates, and the Senate, but a new precedent lay beneath them. Domestic political conflict could end in blood. Cornelia outlived the disaster and became part of the memory surrounding both of her sons. Later, Roman tradition praised her learning, dignity, and devotion, and even if the portrait was shaped by moral admiration, it tells something real about elite Roman households. Politics did not belong only to men standing in the forum. It also ran through marriages, lineages, letters, inheritances, and the expectations placed on sons of famous houses. The Gracchi were public figures, but they were also children of a family whose name carried the weight of Rome's earlier victories. Gaius Gracchus, elected tribune a decade later, was broader in program and more systematic in political imagination. He renewed land reform, supported grain distributions for the urban population, altered jury arrangements in ways that affected equestrian interests, and pressed measures touching colonies, roads, military service, and the status of Rome's Italian allies. Grain distributions can sound like a narrow urban measure, but in a city where food supply, price, and public order were closely connected, grain was never merely grain. It was the daily material through which imperial wealth, civic entitlement, and political leadership met. Gaius understood coalition more clearly than his brother had. He sought support not only from poorer citizens, but from equestrians, provincial taxpayers, settlers, and those who benefited from weakening senatorial monopoly. That made him more formidable, and perhaps more threatening, because he was not simply pleading for a neglected class. He was rearranging the channels through which Roman public power flowed. The Senate's resistance, therefore, came not only from greed or fear, though both were present, but from the recognition that an alternative political center was forming around the tribunate. The question of Italian citizenship sharpened the danger. Rome's allies had fought in Roman armies and shared the burdens of expansion, yet many remained outside the full political community whose wars they helped sustain. Gaius' support for extending rights to them exposed a tension that would only deepen. The Roman system had been strong because it incorporated allies in layers, but those layers became harder to justify after centuries of shared service and unequal reward. Gaius' final confrontation ended, like his brothers, with civic violence. In 121 BCE, after political tension and the killing of an attendant associated with a consul, the Senate passed what later became known as the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, an emergency decree urging magistrates to see that the state took no harm. The formula sounded protective, almost administrative, but its consequence was the use of force against citizens. Gaius died on the Aventine, and thousands of his supporters were later punished. A generation after the Republic had mastered the Mediterranean, it was learning to turn emergency language inward. The Gratian crisis did not solve the land question, the citizenship question, or the balance between Senate and people. Instead, It changed the methods by which such questions could be fought. Popular assemblies could be used against senatorial authority. Senatorial emergency could be used against popular leaders. Public law could carry private fear, and public fear could justify exceptional force. The Republic's forms remained, but they were acquiring harsher uses. Gaius Marius rose in the next stage of this unsettled world. He was not from the oldest Roman nobility, though he was far from an ordinary poor man, and his career drew strength from military success, popular support, and impatience with aristocratic command. The Juguthine War in North Africa, fought against King Jugurtha of Numidia, damaged the reputation of senatorial leadership because bribery, delay, and incompetence seemed to cling to the campaign. Marius presented himself as the capable soldier against the inherited arrogance of noble commanders, a contrast Romans understood readily even when it simplified the truth. His consulship in 107 BCE and his command against Jugurtha marked a shift in the army's social base. Roman recruitment had already been changing under pressure, but Marius's acceptance of volunteers from the capitae censi, citizens with little or no property, became a symbol of transformation. These men could serve for pay, equipment, plunder, and the hope of land after discharge. A soldier's kit, his shield, his pack, his rations, and the road under his feet now belonged to a life that could stretch across years far from home, not merely a season away from the farm. This change did not instantly create private armies in the later sense, but it altered the emotional and material relationship between soldier and commander. A general who could win campaigns, distribute spoils, and secure land for veterans became more than a magistrate temporarily holding command. He became the patron of men whose futures depended on him. The Republic still claimed the soldier's loyalty, but the soldier could see the commander more clearly than the Republic, especially when the commander was the one who led, paid, rewarded, and remembered him. Marius' victories over Jugurtha, and then over the migrating Cimbri and Teutones, brought him extraordinary prestige. Multiple consulships followed, breaking the ordinary rhythm of office and revealing the Republic's willingness to bend its customs under fear. The northern threat had frightened Rome, and Marius's success restored confidence. Yet restoration by extraordinary repetition of command carried its own cost, because each exception taught ambitious men that emergency could be made to justify what custom had once restrained. The Italian allies brought the next great pressure. For generations, they had supplied troops to Roman wars, endured Roman commands, and shared the risks of empire without full access to Roman citizenship. Some local elites wanted the vote, legal standing, and honor that citizenship conferred. Others wanted protection from Roman magistrates or relief from unequal burdens. The social war, beginning in 91 BCE, was therefore not a rebellion of strangers against Rome, but a war of close partners who had become tired of being necessary without being equal. The conflict was bitter, and its geography made it intimate. Italian communities that had stood beside Rome in foreign wars now formed their own political structures, minted coins, and imagined a state that could answer Rome on Italian soil. Rome fought hard, but it also conceded. Citizenship was extended in stages to loyal allies and then to many who laid down arms, not because the Roman elite suddenly became generous, but because the old system could no longer survive unchanged. The lesson was familiar in Roman history, though now on a larger scale. Resistance forced incorporation, and incorporation preserved command. Lucius Cornelius Sulla emerged from these years as Marius's rival and Rome's most severe example of aristocratic restoration by revolutionary means. His command against Mithridates VI of Pontus became the spark. When political maneuvering in Rome transferred that eastern command from Sulla to Marius, Sulla did what no Roman commander had openly done before. He marched his army on Rome. The act altered the Republic more deeply than any speech could have done, because it showed that legions could be brought across the boundary between foreign war and domestic politics. Sulla's first seizure of the city did not end the conflict. Marius returned during Sulla's absence in the east, and Rome endured another round of revenge and fear before Sulla came back victorious from the Mithridatic War. Mithridates himself had challenged Roman power in Asia Minor and Greece, and the Eastern Campaign reminded Rome that provincial resentment could be deadly when combined with a capable king. Yet even that foreign war became inseparable from domestic struggle, because every command, province, army, and treasury now seemed to belong to the conflict over who controlled Rome. When Sulla returned to Italy, civil war followed. His victory brought the proscriptions, lists of men condemned as enemies whose property could be confiscated and whose killing was rewarded. The lists were public, and that publicity mattered. Names became sentences, property became opportunity, fear moved through families, clients, and neighbors with the administrative neatness of posted text. Violence had appeared before in Roman politics, but Sulla gave it a bureaucratic form. The proscriptions also redistributed wealth. Confiscated estates passed to Sulla's supporters, and veterans were settled on land taken from defeated communities or condemned men. For the veterans, such settlements were the reward promised by years of service and loyalty. For those displaced, they were the visible mark of defeat. The countryside could thus carry the memory of civil war in its property boundaries, and the Republic's political wounds settled into fields, houses, and local resentments. As dictator, Sulla tried to rebuild the Republic in favor of the Senate. He increased the Senate's size, restricted the tribunate, regulated magistracies, and attempted to bind ambition once again to an ordered sequence of offices. There is a strange tension in this project. Sulla used unprecedented force to restore precedent, and he broke the Republic's habits in order to protect what he believed its proper form should be. The contradiction was not hidden from later history, even if Sulla himself seems to have trusted the settlement more than events justified. His retirement from power gave the story one final Roman severity. Sulla laid down the dictatorship and withdrew, an act that could be read as proof that he had never wanted kingship. Yet by then, the greater lesson had already been taught. A commander had marched on Rome, seized the state, punished enemies through public lists, rewarded soldiers with land, rewritten institutions, and survived. No later ambitious man needed to invent the path from army to city. He only needed to decide when to take it. The Republic after Sulla was therefore not dead, but it was altered in ways that its own language struggled to admit. The Senate still met, consuls still served, tribunes still spoke, courts still judged, and assemblies still voted. Beneath those continuities, however, lay the knowledge that law could be overcome by command and then remade by the victor. The old Roman genius for turning pressure into procedure had not disappeared. It had been joined by another habit, darker and more tempting, turning force into law after the fact. Across the century from the Gracchi to Sulla, Rome's internal struggles grew from the very success that had made it master of the Mediterranean. Land hunger, allied service, military recruitment, provincial wealth, aristocratic competition, and popular politics all pressed against one another until no settlement remained merely local. Reformers could become threats, generals could become patrons, allies could become enemies, and emergency could become a permanent argument. The Republic had always contained conflict. Now conflict had learned to command armies. With Sulla's example of marching legions on the city still vivid in memory, it was only a matter of time before the next supreme commander, backed by his own victorious army, forced the ultimate confrontation that defined the end of the Republic. Chapter 5: Caesar and the Narrowing World. In 49 BCE, when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the Republic did not end in a single night beside a northern river. It had been narrowing for years through commands extended beyond ordinary limits, debts gathered under aristocratic names, armies bound by long service, and political customs weakened each time they were bent and then called necessary. The river mattered because it marked the boundary of a province, and a governor who crossed it with troops entered Italy not as a private citizen returning to public life, but as a commander bringing war home. Caesar understood the meaning of the act, and so did the men who opposed him. Pompey Magnus had once seemed the greater figure. He had risen young, before holding the regular sequence of magistracies, and Sulla had given him the name Magnus, the Great, before the Republic had quite decided how to contain such a man. His victories against Sertorius in Spain, the pirates in the Mediterranean, and Mithridates in the East brought him triumphs, clients, settlements, and a reputation that reached far beyond Rome. Yet Pompey's strength also exposed a weakness in the state, because the Senate needed extraordinary men and then feared the size of what it had allowed them to become. Marcus Licinius Crassus brought another kind of power. His wealth, gathered through property, speculation, and the ruins left by Sulla's proscriptions, made him indispensable to men whose ambitions required money. He defeated Spartacus' slave revolt, though Pompey also claimed part of the credit when he returned from Spain, and the rivalry between the two commanders remained one of the quieter pressures inside late Republican politics. Rome's public language praised service and honor, but campaigns, elections, games, debts, and clients all required resources. A poor aristocrat might possess an old name, but a rich one could make the name move. Caesar entered among these men with lineage, charm, debt, and an unusual gift for turning risk into opportunity. He claimed descent from Venus through the Julian line, associated himself with the popular cause, and cultivated a public image that combined aristocratic confidence with generosity toward crowds and friends. His early offices were expensive, and his debts were large enough to make caution almost impossible. Ambition in Rome was often spoken in the language of dignity, but it could be driven by creditors as well as glory. The first triumvirate, formed in 60 BCE, was not a legal office. It was an arrangement among Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, each needing what the others could provide. Pompey wanted land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus wanted influence and advantage for his financial allies. Caesar wanted the consulship and then a command large enough to rescue him from debt and elevate him beyond ordinary competition. The Senate had frustrated each man separately. Together, they could make obstruction more costly. Caesar's consulship in 59 BCE showed the roughness of the new politics. Measures were pushed through amid intimidation, alliance, and public pressure, and Caesar secured for himself a long command in Gaul. A provincial assignment might once have been a temporary stage in a public career. For Caesar, Gaul became the place where he gathered soldiers, money, fame, and a written version of events that carried his name back to Rome almost as steadily as dispatches carried military news. The conquest of Gaul was long, severe, and transformative. Caesar fought Helvetii, Germans under Ariovistus, Belgae, Veneti, and many other peoples whose names entered Roman memory through his own account of subjugation. His commentaries were written in a plain third-person style that made his choices appear measured, necessary, and almost impersonal. That restraint was part of their power. The reader met Caesar as if he were only reporting what the situation demanded, while every page quietly strengthened the case for Caesar. Human detail in the Gallic campaigns often appeared as engineering. The bridge over the Rhine in 55 BCE, built with rapid technical confidence, allowed Caesar to cross into German territory and then withdraw after making his point. It was not only a military structure, but a sentence written in timber across a river. Rome could reach where it chose to reach, and Caesar could make that reach visible. In Britain, too, his expeditions brought more prestige than permanent control. But prestige was enough when news returned to a city hungry for signs of greatness. The Gallic War also bound his soldiers to him. They marched through difficult country, endured winters, built camps, raised siege works, and shared the danger and reward of campaigns that stretched far beyond the old seasonal rhythm of citizen service. At Alesia in 52 BCE, when Vercingetorix led a major Gallic resistance, Caesar surrounded the fortified hill town with lines facing inward and outward, besieger and besieged at once. The victory confirmed him as the leading commander of his generation. It also made the question of his return to private life more dangerous, because a man with such an army could not easily become ordinary again. In Rome, the political world tightened around him. Crassus died after his defeat by the Parthians at Cara in 53 BCE, where Eastern ambition ended in a disaster that removed the one man who had balanced Caesar and Pompey within the old arrangement. Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, had already died, weakening the family tie between them. What remained was rivalry, sharpened by senatorial fear, legal maneuvering, and the approaching end of Caesar's command. The Republic had procedures for competition. It had fewer remedies for two men whose dignitas had grown too large for defeat. Cicero watched this world with intelligence and unease. He had exposed Catiline's conspiracy in 63 BCE, risen as a new man through eloquence and legal skill, and loved the Republic as a moral and literary inheritance as much as a political system. Yet his career also revealed the weakness of eloquence when armies stood behind other men. He could persuade, warn, write, and lament with extraordinary force, but he could not command legions. The late Republic gave him a stage large enough for his voice and too dangerous for his remedies. Cato the Younger represented another kind of resistance. Severe, principled, and often politically inflexible, he embodied an ideal of senatorial liberty that admired self-command and distrusted accommodation. To supporters, he was one of the few men who would not bend before power. To others, his refusal to compromise helped drive politics toward the very crisis he feared. This is one of the sadder features of the last Republic. Courage and rigidity could become difficult to separate. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey and many senators withdrew from Rome rather than meet him there. The city, which had once seen Sulla's soldiers enter, now faced another commander returning under arms. Caesar moved with speed through Italy, and Pompey chose to gather strength in the east, where his older settlements and prestige still mattered. The Republic's heart was left behind almost like a symbol too dangerous to hold. Rome remained the prize, but armies elsewhere would decide what Rome could say. The civil war that followed carried Roman command across familiar provinces in unfamiliar combinations. Caesar moved to secure Spain, where Pompeian forces threatened his rear, then turned toward the eastern struggle. At Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Pompey's forces were defeated, and the older great man fled to Egypt, where he was killed before Caesar arrived. The murder was meant to please the victor, but Caesar is said to have received Pompey's severed head and signet ring with grief, or at least with the public shape of grief. Roman aristocrats could destroy one another and still understand that a diminished republic had lost something in each noble death. Egypt drew Caesar into the politics of the Ptolemaic court. Cleopatra VII, young, intelligent, and politically endangered, allied herself with him in her struggle for the throne against her brother. Alexandria was not a provincial town, but a Hellenistic capital of libraries, dynastic ceremony, Greek learning, Egyptian kingship, and Mediterranean wealth. Caesar's involvement there was personal and strategic at once. Through Cleopatra, he entered a royal world that Roman moralists would later find useful to fear, admire, and condemn. After further campaigns in Asia, Africa, and Spain, Caesar returned to a dominance no republican precedent could comfortably hold. He accepted repeated consulships and the dictatorship, eventually for life, and carried out reforms that were practical as well as political. The calendar reform of 46 BCE, assisted by Alexandrian astronomical knowledge, corrected accumulated disorder and gave Rome a more stable measurement of civic time. Colonies were founded, debts addressed, the Senate enlarged, and provincial administration adjusted. A ruler could be dangerous and capable at the same time. Rome was learning the difficulty of judging power that repaired while it overwhelmed. The honors granted to Caesar unsettled many observers. His statue stood among kings. His person received sacral and ceremonial distinctions. His chair, dress, and titles suggested a man being raised above ordinary citizenship. Whether Caesar intended formal kingship remains debated, and ancient sources preserve both rumor and theatrical testing of public reaction. The deeper fact was plain enough. The Republic had no safe category for a citizen who held armies, offices, honors, and gratitude in such concentration. On the Ides of March in 44 BCE, a group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, killed Caesar during a meeting of the Senate. They called themselves liberators, and they believed, or needed to believe, that the removal of the man would allow the Republic to breathe again. The choice of Brutus' name carried its own burden, because Roman memory placed another Brutus at the founding of liberty after the kings. Yet repetition did not restore the old world. The first Brutus had stood at the imagined beginning of the Republic. The later Brutus, acted after centuries of conquest, had made that Republic almost impossible to recover. Caesar's funeral turned assassination into another kind of crisis. Mark Antony, Caesar's colleague and ally, used the occasion to expose the emotional force still attached to the dead dictator, while Caesar's will named his young relative Gaius Octavius as adopted son and heir. Wax masks, public display, wounds, honors, and memory all worked upon the crowd, not as theater alone, but as Roman political language. Elite funerals had long taught the living how to think about ancestry and service. Caesar's funeral taught Rome that the dead could still command. Octavian, soon known in politics as Caesar's son, entered with a name larger than his years. He was young, careful, physically unimposing compared with some rivals, and underestimated by men who mistook youth for weakness. Antony had experience, troops, and immediate standing. The Senate hoped at times to use Octavian against him. Cicero, in his Philippics, poured his old eloquence into the attempt to defend senatorial freedom by managing the ambitions of Caesar's heir. It was a delicate and dangerous calculation. The Republic had become skilled at using powerful men against one another, and unskilled at surviving the winner. The Second Triumvirate, formed in 43 BCE by Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, was unlike the first. It had legal recognition and openly extraordinary powers. Its prescriptions revived the memory of Sulla, with lists, confiscations, rewards, and fear moving again through Roman society. Cicero was among those marked for death, and his final hours became one of the most remembered endings of the age. The man whose voice had defended the Republic in courts, Senate meetings, letters, and philosophical works was overtaken by a politics in which voice could no longer protect the speaker. The defeat of Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE removed the principal assassins from the struggle, but it did not settle the Roman world. The victors divided power uneasily. Antony took the eastern provinces and drew closer to Cleopatra's Egypt. Octavian worked in Italy and the West, facing the hard tasks of veteran settlement, public image, and military consolidation. Land was taken for soldiers, towns were disturbed, and the promises made by commanders settled into the lives of civilians who had not stood in the battles that decided their property. Civil war always reached beyond the men who chose it. Lepidus faded from real importance, leaving Antony and Octavian to become the final pair in the Republic's long narrowing. Their rivalry was political, military, and cultural. Octavian's propaganda presented Antony as a Roman corrupted by Eastern monarchy and Cleopatra's influence, while Antony's supporters could point to Octavian's youth, severity, and calculated ambition. Beneath the accusations lay a simpler structure. The Roman world could no longer contain two supreme commanders. By the time the conflict moved toward Actium, the Republic's old language had become almost ghostly. Men still invoked liberty, senate, people, magistracy, and ancestral custom, but the decisive resources were fleets, legions, provincial revenues, names, marriages, inheritances, and control of public memory. Caesar had not created all these forces. He had risen through them, mastered them, and been killed by men who believed that death could undo what history had already arranged. The world that narrowed around Caesar narrowed further after him. Pompey, Crassus, Cato, Cicero, Brutus, Cassius, and Antony all belonged to the last generations of a political order that could still speak as though aristocratic competition might be restored to balance. Octavian understood something colder and more durable. The Romans did not need to be told that monarchy had returned. They needed to be given peace, legality, ritual, and enough familiar names that monarchy could be accepted under another shape. Chapter 6: Augustus and the Invention of Peace. Once the last great rival was defeated and the whole world rested under a single command, the victor could begin the careful, monumental work of cloaking absolute power in the dignified costume of a republic restored. The defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium in 31 BCE gave Octavian the one thing no Roman leader since Sulla had held for long without immediate rival: command over the Roman world with the largest competing army removed. The battle itself was fought off the western coast of Greece, where Agrippa's naval pressure, Antony's difficult position, and Cleopatra's presence turned a long political struggle into a military decision. Later writers shaped the event into a contest between Roman discipline and Eastern luxury, but the quieter fact was more important. After Actium, the Republic's exhausted institutions had to receive a victor too powerful to be treated as one magistrate among others. Antony and Cleopatra withdrew to Egypt, and in 30 BCE their deaths ended the last great opposition to Octavian's rule. Egypt became not an ordinary senatorial province, but the personal domain of the princeps, governed by a prefect of equestrian rank and guarded from senatorial ambition. That arrangement alone shows Octavian's caution. He understood that Egypt's grain, wealth, and memory of royal power made it too dangerous to place in the hands of another aristocrat with an old name and a large appetite for distinction. Rome had been promised restoration before. Sulla had restored the Republic after marching on it, and Caesar had held dictatorship while presenting reform as public necessity. Octavian's task was more delicate, because he needed to keep the substance of supremacy while refusing the appearance of kingship. The Romans had murdered Caesar in part because honors and concentration of power had begun to look too openly monarchical. Caesar's heir therefore built a monarchy that spent much of its language denying that it was one. In 27 BCE, Octavian staged the first great settlement. He formally handed powers back to the Senate and people, and in return received command over key provinces containing most of the legions, along with the name Augustus. The title carried religious and moral weight without saying king. It suggested elevation, reverence, and public blessing, while leaving older republican words in place. The Senate still met, consuls still held office, laws still passed, and magistracies still carried ancestral names. Beneath those forms, military power rested where it needed to rest, with Augustus. This was the invention of the Principate. Its genius lay in managed ambiguity. Augustus was princeps, the first man, not rex, not dictator for life, not a monarch in the blunt language Rome had been trained to hate. He accumulated powers that could be described separately and legally: tribunician power, proconsular command, priestly authority, control of provinces, influence over elections, and the unrivaled prestige of one who had ended civil war. A modern reader may be tempted to call this disguise, and it was partly that, but it was also a Roman way of making the unacceptable livable by distributing it among familiar forms. The city itself helped teach the lesson. Augustus boasted, according to Suetonius, that he found Rome built of brick and left it clothed in marble. And although the phrase is too neat to carry the whole truth, it points toward a real transformation. Temples were restored, forums planned, public buildings repaired, aqueducts maintained, and older materials increasingly stood beside polished stone from the wider empire. The change mattered because political order was made visible in streets and monuments. Peace could be walked through, measured, and seen. Agrippa's role in that visible order was immense. Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa had been Octavian's closest military and administrative partner, the commander whose naval skill helped win Actium and whose practical energy helped reshape Rome. He sponsored baths, repaired aqueducts, oversaw public works, and gave the city buildings that turned victory into civic usefulness. The Pantheon in its first Augustan form belonged to his program, and even where later rebuilding changed what survives, the memory of Agrippa's name on the facade kept the association between public benefit and Augustan rule alive. Administrative order reached beyond the city. Augustus reorganized provinces, distinguishing between senatorial provinces, where the old aristocracy could still govern under supervision, and imperial provinces, where legions stood and the princeps' authority was decisive. Taxation became more regular in many places. Census counted people and property, and provincial elites found new paths toward honor through cooperation with Rome. A provincial taxpayer might never see Augustus, but the assessment of land, the presence of a governor, the repair of a road, or the milestone naming imperial authority made the new order tangible. The army was settled into a more permanent shape. Legions became long-service professional forces, supported by a treasury and stationed in provinces where their loyalty had to be attached to the emperor rather than to passing republican commanders. Veterans received colonies and land grants, sometimes far from Italy, extending Roman habits into provincial landscapes. The Praetorian Guard, stationed as an elite force connected to the emperor's security, gave the new order a protective body near the center. Rome had learned from the late Republic that armies made politics. Augustus answered by making the army part of the imperial household of power. A census under Augustus was more than a count. It registered citizens, property, and public belonging, and it allowed the ruler to present himself as the careful restorer of order after years when civil war had unsettled categories of status and obligation. Numbers mattered to Roman government, not with modern precision in every corner, but as signs of reach and claim. When the Res Gestae later recorded Augustus's censuses and gifts, it presented rule through the calm language of accounting. Citizens counted, money given, temples restored, games held, colonies founded, enemies subdued. The moral legislation of Augustus belonged to the same effort, though it entered more intimate territory. Laws encouraged marriage, punished adultery among the elite, rewarded children, and sought to discipline the behavior of the governing class. The private household became a public concern because Augustus imagined, or claimed to imagine, moral order as part of political recovery. Yet the laws also revealed the limits of command. Families did not become orderly merely because law instructed them to do so, and the scandals of Augustus's own household made the distance between program and life painfully visible. Livia, Augustus' wife, stood near the center of that household politics. Ancient writers often treated powerful women with suspicion, and their portraits of Livia must be read carefully, but her importance cannot be dismissed. She connected families, represented continuity, and belonged to the dynastic arrangements by which Augustus tried to solve the problem he could never state too plainly: how a restored republic could pass supreme power from one man to another. The old republic had annual magistrates. The principate needed succession, and succession made monarchy visible. The deaths and disappointments within Augustus' family gave the new system its private sorrow and public danger. Marcellus, Agrippa, Gaius, Lucius, and other hoped-for heirs died or fell away before the succession could settle as Augustus wished. Tiberius, Livia's son from her earlier marriage, eventually became the necessary heir after years of uneasy positioning. This was not only family misfortune, it was constitutional strain expressed through household loss, because the future of the Roman world had become entangled with marriages, adoptions, funerals, and the health of young men raised under the emperor's eye. Culture helped soften the new order. Maecenas, a close associate of Augustus, supported poets whose works would become inseparable from the age. Virgil's Aeneid gave Rome a past large enough for empire, joining Trojan memory, Italian destiny, piety, loss, and Augustan peace in one long poem. Horace's odes could praise moderation, countryside, friendship, and public renewal with a voice more intimate than official inscription. Such works were not mere propaganda, though they served the climate of the regime. They helped Rome imagine that civil war had not only ended, but had been gathered into meaning. The Ara Pacis, dedicated in 9 BCE, gave stone form to that meaning. Processions of priests, family members, magistrates, and symbolic abundance surrounded an altar to peace, making fertility, sacrifice, dynasty, and public order part of a single visual language. Children appear in the reliefs, garments fall in careful folds, and the imperial household moves as though private lineage and civic future belonged naturally together. The monument did not argue loudly. It allowed Romans to see peace as a family procession and a ritual fact. Provincial life under Augustus varied widely. In some places, Roman rule meant heavier taxation. Local elites reshaped around imperial favor and the presence of soldiers whose needs could burden communities. In others, it meant commercial stability, legal privileges, road improvements, and opportunities for ambitious families to enter wider networks of power. The empire was never one experience. It was a structure of differences held together by roads, commands, tax flows, legal categories, local bargains, and the prestige of a ruler whose image appeared on coins far beyond the city. Coins carried Augustus with special efficiency. A denarius or aureus could place his head, titles, heirs, victories, temples, comets, or moral claims into daily exchange. Money moved where speeches did not, and its small surfaces taught the empire to recognize the new center. In a market town in Spain, a military camp near the Rhine, or a port in Asia Minor, the image of the princeps could pass from hand to hand with the ordinary business of buying, paying, saving, and owing. That ordinariness was one of empire's strengths. The Augustan peace was not the absence of war. Campaigns continued in Spain, the Alps, the Balkans, Africa, and along the northern frontiers. Roman writers could speak of peace because civil war had ended and because enemies were imagined as pushed outward from the ordered world. For the communities at the edges of expansion, Roman peace could arrive as conquest, census, road building, hostage-taking, and taxation. The phrase Pax Romana was therefore never simple. It was calm at the center, pressure at the margins, and administration everywhere it could reach. Germania tested that reach. Roman operations beyond the Rhine had seemed to promise a new province, and commanders moved through forests, river corridors, tribal politics, and fragile alliances with the confidence of a state accustomed to eventual success. Publius Quintilius Varus governed in the region with the habits of provincial command, but the settlement was not as secure as it appeared. Arminius, a Cheruscan leader who had served with Rome and understood Roman methods, helped organize resistance that would undo 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in 9 CE. The loss was severe, and later memory made Augustus's grief part of the story. 3 legionary numbers disappeared from the army's future, and the defeat placed a limit on Roman ambition east of the Rhine. It did not destroy the empire, but it changed the shape of its northern policy. The Rhine became less a temporary line on the way to deeper conquest and more a frontier that Roman power would manage, fortify, cross and recross without absorbing all beyond it. There is a useful restraint in this moment. Augustus had built a system that claimed restoration, order and divine favor, yet a frontier disaster still revealed the ordinary limits of distance, weather, terrain, intelligence and local politics. No settlement, however carefully arranged, abolished contingency. The empire could count citizens, pay soldiers, repair roads, and fill altars with the language of peace, but it could still lose men in forests it did not understand well enough. In 14 CE, Augustus died at Nola after more than 4 decades of supremacy. The transition to Tiberius was tense but successful, and that success may have been the most important proof that the new order had taken root. Caesar had been killed because Rome could not endure his concentration of power in the form he gave it. Augustus died in bed, was honored among the gods, and left an heir. The difference measured the distance between dictatorship and principate. The Republic had not returned, but neither had monarchy arrived in the old forbidden name. What Augustus left was a political language in which obedience could call itself loyalty to restored order, and in which supreme power lived inside republican ceremonies like a new inhabitant in an old house. Senators retained rank, magistrates retained titles, citizens retained memories, and provinces received a more regular command than the late Republic had often given them. Underneath, the legions knew where authority lay. Augustus's achievement was therefore not the creation of peace alone. It was the creation of a form by which Romans could accept the end of one political world without saying too sharply that it had ended. The city that had driven out kings now possessed a ruler whose power exceeded that of many kings, but it also possessed roads, grain, laws, games, temples, colonies, poetry, and a public story in which the wounds of civil war had been bound. For a tired empire of citizens and subjects, that story was strong enough to last beyond the man who made it. The stability Augustus constructed allowed the empire to turn its attention outward again, translating imperial authority into the physical reality of roads, taxes, and conquest, from the wilds of Britain to the complicated settlements in Judea. Chapter 7. Britain, Fire, Judea, and the Flavian Repair. Beyond Italy, the early empire took shape through provinces that were not merely conquered spaces, but places where Roman authority had to be translated into roads, courts, taxation, local elites, military presence, and the habits of ordinary obedience. Augustus had left a system strong enough to survive his death, but not simple enough to free his successors from danger. The ruler now stood at the center of armies, aristocratic expectation, household intrigue, provincial petitions, urban crowds, and the memory of a republic that had lost power without losing its language. Each emperor after Augustus had to inherit not only authority, but the careful fiction that authority still belonged to the old public order. Tiberius, who succeeded in 14 CE, understood the weight of that fiction more than most. He was experienced, capable, and deeply marked by the long disciplines of the Augustan household. Yet his reign came to be remembered through suspicion, withdrawal, and the poisonous atmosphere surrounding treason trials. The Senate still met, and senators still spoke with inherited dignity, but many learned to read the emperor's silences as carefully as his words. Under Tiberius, the Principate revealed one of its lasting difficulties. When one man's favor mattered more than public procedure, uncertainty itself became a form of power. The provinces under Tiberius and his successors did not experience imperial rule only as palace anxiety. Governors heard cases, collected taxes, supervised local elites, and corresponded with Rome over matters that could seem small from the center and immense in the towns where they occurred. Roads tied military districts to cities, ports carried grain and oil, and inscriptions placed imperial names in stone for communities that wanted to show loyalty in forms the regime could recognize. In this world, Being Roman increasingly meant entering a system of law, patronage, army service, and public display that reached far beyond birth in Rome itself. Caligula, who followed Tiberius in 37 CE, inherited enormous goodwill as the son of Germanicus, whose memory remained beloved among soldiers and people. His early reign began with hope, but ancient accounts soon turned toward extravagance, fear, illness, humiliation of the Senate, and the strange instability of a ruler who made rank feel unsafe. The sources are hostile, and their appetite for moral scandal requires caution. Still, his assassination in 41 CE by members of the Praetorian Guard showed that the emperor's body, not any written constitution, had become the point where political crisis gathered. Claudius came to power in the confusion after Caligula's death, brought forward by the Praetorians rather than elevated through a serene public choice. He was an unlikely ruler in the eyes of many aristocrats, older, scholarly, physically awkward according to hostile descriptions, and long underestimated inside the imperial family. Yet his reign proved administratively serious. Freedmen in his household gained influence, legal work continued, and the machinery of government expanded in ways that aristocratic writers disliked, partly because they could feel power moving through channels they did not control. The conquest of Britain in 43 CE gave Claudius the military prestige he needed. Julius Caesar had crossed to the island nearly a century earlier, but permanent occupation had not followed. Under Claudius, Roman forces landed in strength, defeated resistance in the southeast, and began the slow work of turning part of the island into a province. The emperor himself appeared briefly to receive the honor of victory, with elephants included in later accounts of the display, a detail that suited a ruler who needed conquest to make his authority visible. Britain was remote, wet, mineral-rich, politically divided, and difficult to absorb. For Rome, it became both trophy and frontier. Provincial conquest there did not mean a single submission. Client kings, tribal elites, military roads, forts, and veteran colonies all formed part of the Roman method, and the resistance of Boudica in 60 or 61 CE showed how violent misrule could turn local grievance into wider revolt. Boudica, queen of the Iceni, rose after abuses committed against her family and kingdom, and her forces destroyed Roman settlements including Camulodunum and Londinium before being defeated. The physical suffering of that revolt need not be dwelt upon to understand its meaning. Roman conquest depended not only on legions, but on the behavior of officials, creditors, and settlers who could make empire intolerable before it became ordinary. Claudius also altered the Roman governing class through inclusion. In a speech preserved in bronze at Lyon and echoed by Tacitus, he argued for admitting leading men from Gaul into the Senate. The proposal was conservative in one sense, because it strengthened imperial order by rewarding provincial loyalty, yet it changed the meaning of Roman aristocracy. Families whose grandfathers had not sat in the old Republican Senate could now enter the highest public body in the empire. Rome was still the name at the center, but the center had begun to draw men from the provinces it ruled. Nero, who succeeded Claudius in 54 CE, came to power young, with Seneca and Burrus guiding the early years and Agrippina the Younger, his mother, pressing her own claims within the household. At first, the reign could be presented as a restoration of better government after the perceived irregularities of Claudius' court. Over time, the balance failed. Nero's relationship with the Senate worsened, his artistic ambitions offended aristocratic expectations, and deaths within the imperial family darkened the story told by later writers. In Rome's elite memory, the emperor became a figure of performance, fear, and unmeasured self-regard. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE became inseparable from that memory. The fire burned through crowded districts where upper rooms, shops, shrines, warehouses, narrow streets, and timber made the city vulnerable to flame. Nero was away at Antium when it began, according to Tacitus, and returned to organize relief. Yet rumor attached him to the disaster with a tenacity that relief measures could not undo. Afterward, rebuilding regulations required broader streets, limits on building height, and the use of more fire-resistant materials. A catastrophe had become an administrative problem, and administration became part of the emperor's defense. Nero's new palace, the Domus Aurea, damaged that defense. Built across land opened by the fire, with gardens, porticos, water features, and lavish surfaces, it made imperial appropriation visible at precisely the moment when many needed reassurance that the city remained theirs. The emperor's taste, which might have seemed merely extravagant in another context, now appeared as a political wound. Rome could accept magnificence from its rulers, but magnificence became dangerous when it seemed to rise from public loss. The persecution of Christians after the fire belonged to this same atmosphere of accusation and fear. Tacitus describes Christians as a hated group blamed by Nero, and his account is hostile to them, while also hostile to the cruelty of the punishment. The community was still small in Rome. Without the public power it would acquire centuries later, but here it entered imperial history as a vulnerable minority caught inside the politics of rumor. The episode is brief in the great scale of Roman government, yet it would later be remembered from the other side when Christian writers looked back on Nero as the first imperial persecutor. While Rome carried the memory of fire, Judea moved toward revolt. Roman rule there had long been complicated by local kingship, priestly authority, taxation, faction, religious devotion, and the difficulty of fitting Jewish law and expectation inside imperial administration. Tensions grew under procurators whose actions were remembered as greedy or provocative, and in 66 CE, revolt became open. What began in one province soon required major Roman military attention, because resistance in Judea was not a border raid, but a challenge to imperial control in a land of deep religious and symbolic weight. Josephus, born Yosef ben Matityahu, became one of the essential witnesses to the Jewish war. He first commanded Jewish forces in Galilee, surrendered to the Romans, and later attached himself to the Flavian side, writing histories in Greek that tried to explain the conflict to a wider imperial world. His position was morally and politically complicated, and his works must be read with awareness of self-defense. Yet through him, the war gains a recorded human closeness: councils, factions, sieges, prophecies, negotiations, and the painful effort to make catastrophe intelligible after survival. Nero's own fall came before the war in Judea reached its most famous end. Revolts in the provinces, senatorial hostility, and military abandonment gathered against him in 68 CE. When he died, the Julio-Claudian line ended, and the empire discovered how exposed the principate remained when dynastic legitimacy failed. The year 69 CE became the year of the four emperors: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, each in turn showing how armies in different regions could make and unmake rulers. Rome had avoided civil war for a century only because the Augustan arrangement had held. Once it broke, the legions remembered their power. Galba's severity, Otho's brief claim, and Vitellius's support from the German armies all passed through the year with weary speed. The decisive strength gathered around Vespasian, who commanded in the east and had the support of forces connected to the Judean campaign, as well as important backing from governors and the Egyptian grain supply. Egypt mattered here as it had mattered under Augustus. Whoever could influence the grain route could touch Rome's stomach as well as its politics. Vespasian's cause showed that imperial power now belonged to a network of provinces, armies, and supplies, not simply to the old capital. Vespasian entered rule as a soldier emperor of practical temperament. He lacked the Julio-Claudian bloodline, so he built legitimacy through victory, fiscal repair, public order, and dynastic presentation. Taxes were restored or increased, discipline emphasized, and the state's finances steadied after the extravagance and civil conflict of Nero's final years. Ancient anecdotes made him plain, humorous, and frugal. though such portraits are always shaped by contrast. After Nero, usefulness itself became a political virtue. The Jewish War gave the Flavian dynasty its central victory. Titus, Vespasian's son, completed the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The city fell, and the temple was destroyed, an event of immeasurable consequence for Jewish history and of great symbolic value for Rome's new rulers. The spoils were carried in triumph, and the Arch of Titus later showed the menorah and sacred objects borne through Roman ceremony. For the Flavians, this was the display of restored imperial authority. For the Jewish people, it marked a rupture whose memory would continue far beyond the empire that celebrated it. The Flavian amphitheatre, later called the Colosseum, rose on land associated with Nero's private palace. That choice was political in stone. Where Nero had claimed space for imperial luxury, Vespasian and Titus gave Rome a public building for games, seating, spectacle, and civic hierarchy. The seating itself reflected rank, with senators, equestrians, citizens, women, and the poor placed according to a social order made visible in rows. The building did not abolish inequality, it arranged it in public and called the arrangement Roman. Titus' short reign from 79 to 81 CE was remembered with affection, partly because later tradition saw in him generosity and restraint after the harsher possibilities of imperial power. His years, however, were marked by disaster. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 buried Pompeii, Herculaneum, and nearby communities under ash, pumice, and volcanic material, preserving streets, bakeries, wall notices, painted rooms, shop counters, and ordinary objects with a stillness no ancient observer could have intended. Pliny the Younger, writing later to Tacitus, preserved the death of his uncle, Pliny the Elder, who approached the eruption out of duty and curiosity. Through those letters, Roman disaster is seen not as spectacle, but as inquiry, obligation, and loss held in measured prose. Pompeii gives the early empire a human scale that palaces cannot provide. Its walls carried election notices, advertisements, jokes, names, and rough writing. Bakeries held mills and ovens, shops opened onto streets, and houses ranged from modest rooms to decorated residences whose paintings mixed myth, garden illusion, and domestic pride. Such details do not stop the history. They make clear what imperial peace contained. While emperors rose and fell, people bought bread, supported candidates, repaired thresholds, worshipped household gods, and left marks on plaster without knowing they would become evidence. Domitian, the younger son of Vespasian, ruled longer than Titus and left a more troubled memory among senatorial writers. He strengthened frontier defenses, campaigned along the Rhine and Danube, raised soldiers' pay, and took administration seriously, but his relations with the Senate became increasingly strained. The title Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, whether used officially or emphasized by hostile sources, captured aristocratic fear that the emperor no longer cared to soften power with Augustan modesty. Domitian's government may have been more effective than his reputation allowed, yet effectiveness did not protect him from hatred within the elite. In 96 CE, Domitian was assassinated in a palace conspiracy, and the Senate quickly welcomed Nerva as emperor. The moment closed the Flavian house and opened another experiment in succession. Looking back across the Julio-Claudian and Flavian years, the empire had changed greatly without announcing a new constitution. Britain had become a province, Judea had been subdued at terrible cost, Rome had burned and been rebuilt, the first dynasty had ended, provincial armies had made emperors, and a new family had restored order by turning victory and public building into legitimacy. The early empire had therefore learned several lessons at once. Bloodline could help, but not guarantee rule. The Senate still mattered, especially as a keeper of memory and status, but armies could decide faster than speeches. Provinces were not passive possessions. They supplied grain, soldiers, senators, revolts, taxes, witnesses, and emperors. Rome itself remained symbolically immense, but the empire's life ran through harbors, camps, roads, courts, provincial capitals, and local bargains far from the forum. By the end of the 1st century CE, Augustus's invention had survived mad rumor, assassination, conquest, fire, rebellion, civil war, and dynastic replacement. That survival did not make the system gentle or secure. It made it proven. The Principate could outlive the family that founded it, absorb men from outside the old center, punish revolt, repair finances, and cover the scars of private rule with public works. The next age would remember itself as calmer, more orderly, and more fortunate, but the steadiness of that age rested on everything these first imperial generations had revealed. The empire was not Rome enlarged in a simple way, but a vast arrangement of obedience, ambition, memory, and force, held together by the continuing belief that the world still had a Roman center. The success of the Flavian house in restoring order and the subsequent shift toward adoptive emperors created a period of administrative focus, where the great task was no longer mere survival, but the organization and maintenance of vast, distant frontiers. Chapter 8: Administration in the Age of Wide Frontiers. The machinery of the empire worked best when succession did not become a crisis. After Domitian's assassination in 96 CE, the Senate accepted Nerva, an elderly senator whose value lay partly in the absence of military danger around him. He did not found a dynasty through blood, and his reign was brief, but his adoption of Trajan gave later Romans a pattern they could remember with unusual satisfaction. Authority passed, or seemed to pass, toward competence rather than merely toward family, and for a time the empire benefited from that appearance as much as from the reality beneath it. Nerva's position was not as secure as memory later made the age appear. The Praetorian Guard remained dangerous, and the army's affection did not naturally belong to an old civilian ruler chosen after a palace murder. By adopting Marcus Ulpius Traianus, a senator and commander from Italica in Spain, Nerva joined himself to a man whose military standing could quiet the forces that had unsettled him. The act was practical before it became idealized, yet practicality often becomes tradition when it works, and Trajan's succession allowed the Principate to imagine that adoption could solve the problem Augustus had left behind. Trajan entered rule in 98 CE as the first emperor born in a provincial family outside Italy, though his world was thoroughly Roman in status, language, and ambition. His Spanish origin mattered not because he was foreign to Rome, but because Rome itself had widened. Provincial elites had been entering the Senate for generations, and now one of them held the highest power in the empire. The old city remained sacred in memory and ceremony, but the governing class increasingly came from the provinces that Roman conquest had once subordinated. His reign carried the confidence of expansion. The Dacian Wars, fought north of the Danube against King Decebalus, gave Trajan military glory, treasure, and a new province whose mines and strategic position seemed to justify the effort. Dacia was not an easy prize. It lay beyond the river frontier, in rugged country where earlier Roman campaigns had already revealed the difficulty of making victory permanent. Trajan's achievement, therefore, belonged both to military force and to the Roman capacity to turn conquest quickly into roads, forts, colonies, mining administration, and public memory. The column of Trajan made that memory rise in stone. Its spiral relief carried scenes of marching, building, sacrificing, fighting, negotiating, and receiving submission, with the emperor repeatedly present in controlled, legible authority. The column did not present conquest as a single moment of violence, but as a long sequence of ordered acts. Soldiers cut timber, cross rivers, build camps, stand in formation, and carry the habits of Roman discipline into Dacian terrain. It is a monument to victory, but also to administration, because the empire liked to remember its wars as labor organized under command. Dacian gold helped fill the imperial treasury, and Rome received the conquest in festivals, distributions, and monumental display. Yet, even here, success carried future obligations. A province beyond the Danube required defense, roads, settlement, and men who could hold what glory had taken. The empire's greatest victories often became permanent responsibilities. A conquered land was not truly possessed on the day of triumph, but through all the years afterward, when pay had to be issued, disputes settled, mines supervised, and frontiers watched in weather that did not care about Roman ceremony. Trajan's eastern campaigns later carried him against the Parthian world through Armenia and Mesopotamia, and for a brief time Roman power seemed to stretch farther than ever before. Titles and provinces followed the advance, and the empire reached its greatest formal extent. But distance placed its own argument against ambition. The farther command moved from the Mediterranean center, the more supply, local politics, illness, resistance, and succession pressed against it. Trajan died in 117 CE, and the empire he left was magnificent, burdened, and slightly overextended. Hadrian, his successor, chose consolidation. Ancient accounts of his accession carry uncertainty and court intrigue, especially around the role of Plotina, Trajan's widow, and the timing of adoption. Whatever the exact circumstances, Hadrian's policy soon became clear. He abandoned some of Trajan's eastern acquisitions and turned imperial attention toward defensible limits, disciplined armies, provincial inspection, and the presence of the emperor across the empire's many regions. The change was not a retreat from Roman greatness. It was a different judgment about how greatness endured. Hadrian traveled more extensively than any emperor before him. He moved through Gaul, Germany, Britain, Spain, Africa, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and the Danube provinces, appearing not merely as a distant name on coins, but as a ruler who inspected troops, heard petitions, founded cities, restored monuments, and entered local memories. A province visited by the emperor did not cease to be provincial, but imperial presence gave local elites a chance to display loyalty and receive favor. The journey of a ruler became a moving court, and the empire for a time saw itself being seen. In Britain, Hadrian's Wall gave the age one of its most durable lines of stone. Built across northern Britain, beginning in the 120s CE, it was not simply a wall in the modern imagination, nor an absolute barrier between Roman and non-Roman worlds. It included forts, mile castles, turrets, gates, roads, ditches, and customs of movement, a controlled zone where soldiers watched, recorded, traded, and negotiated as well as guarded. The wall measured distance in Roman units and made frontier policy visible across hills, rivers, and unsettled weather. An auxiliary soldier stationed along such a frontier lived inside the empire's layered citizenship. Many auxiliaries were not citizens when they entered service, but after long years they could receive citizenship for themselves and legal recognition for their families, recorded on bronze diplomas. Those documents, folded and inscribed, made Rome's promise portable and durable. The empire could be harsh, but it also knew how to bind men to it through status, paper, pay, and the hope that service would alter a household's future. Hadrian's imagination also moved toward Greece. He admired Greek culture, completed or supported building projects in Athens, and presented himself as a ruler at home in the older prestige of the Hellenic world. This was not a rejection of Rome. It was part of the empire's maturity, because Roman identity no longer needed to fear Greek refinement in the old Catonian way. The conqueror had become curator, patron, imitator, and heir, and the eastern cities learned to speak to imperial power in a language of shared antiquity. Not all of Hadrian's reign rested in order. The Bar Kokhba revolt in Judea, beginning in 1302 CE, became one of the most severe conflicts of his rule. Roman suppression was heavy, and afterward the province and its symbolic geography were reshaped in ways that carried long memory. Jerusalem was refounded as Aelia Capitolina, and Jewish presence in the city was restricted. The details of suffering need no elaboration here. the consequence is enough. Rome could administer difference for long periods, but when revolt touched sacred geography and imperial authority together, its answer could be remorseless. Hadrian's succession arrangements were careful and sorrow-marked. His first chosen heir, Lucius Aelius, died before taking power, and Hadrian then adopted Antoninus Pius on the condition that Antoninus adopt Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. The sequence created a chain of legitimacy that reached beyond one reign, as though the uncertainties of family and mortality could be steadied by legal fatherhood. Adoption in this period was not sentimental language alone. It was constitutional engineering carried through household form. Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 38 to 161 CE, gave the empire one of its least dramatic and therefore most administratively revealing reigns. He did not travel as Hadrian had traveled, nor did he seek Trajan's distant conquests. His long rule was marked by legal decisions, fiscal care, respect for senatorial forms, and the maintenance of a settled imperial image. Later generations found fewer great stories in him because stability often leaves less vivid narrative than crisis. Yet for those living inside the empire, such steadiness may have mattered more than memorable drama. The empire under Antoninus was not without war or trouble, but its central systems held. Provincial communities continued to build temples, baths, theaters, aqueducts, and local monuments bearing imperial names. Cities competed for titles and favor. Local benefactors paid for public works, and Roman citizenship spread gradually through service, grant, and status. In North Africa, Spain, Gaul, Asia Minor, and Syria, the empire's life was urban, legal, agricultural, commercial, and ceremonial all at once. Pliny the Younger, whose letters belong earlier under Trajan, gives a useful window into this administrative world. As governor of Bithynia Pontus, he wrote to Trajan about finances, buildings, fire brigades, local societies, legal doubts, and the treatment of Christians. The letters show empire at a scale below conquest, a bath project over budget, a city's accounts in disorder, a question about public associations, a governor unsure how far punishment should go. Trajan's replies are brief, practical, and sometimes cautious. Together they reveal a government whose authority depended on countless small decisions made far from Rome. The law also gathered weight in these centuries. Jurists refined categories, emperors issued rescripts, and citizenship carried more predictable meanings across distance. Roman law was not yet the later codified inheritance that medieval and modern worlds would study, but it was already a way of thinking that made status, property, obligation, and procedure part of imperial order. A provincial petitioner might approach Rome not only as a conqueror's capital, but as a source of judgment. That expectation helped the empire endure, because power wrapped in law can feel less like mere force, even when force remains beneath it. Marcus Aurelius inherited this broad and disciplined world in 1601 CE, sharing rule at first with Lucius Verus. The arrangement was unusual, but not impossible within the flexible habits of the Principate, and it reflected the succession plan Antoninus had received from Hadrian. Marcus came to power with a reputation for seriousness, philosophical discipline, and devotion to duty. Later admiration has often made him the philosopher emperor, but he spent much of his reign with war, plague, and administrative burden rather than studies leisure. The Parthian War under Lucius Verus brought Roman armies east again and ended with success, but returning troops likely helped carry the Antonine plague through the empire. The disease, often identified by modern scholars as smallpox or a similar epidemic, spread through military and civilian networks with consequences that are difficult to measure precisely but clearly severe. It touched cities, camps, households, and tax systems, reducing confidence in the steady abundance of the age. An empire connected by roads and armies could move grain, letters, judges, and soldiers. It could also move illness. Marcus then faced pressure along the Danube in the Marcomannic Wars. Germanic and Sarmatian groups crossed or pressed against the frontier, and the emperor spent long years near the northern military zones, far from the calm image later readers sometimes attached to him. The Meditations, written in Greek and not intended as public imperial propaganda, preserve a mind working through duty, mortality, irritation, restraint, and the smallness of fame. They are not an escape from imperial burden. They are one man's disciplined attempt to remain inwardly ordered while the outer world required continuous attention. On the Danube, the empire's frontier policy appeared in its full complexity. Rome fought, negotiated, resettled groups, recruited outsiders, punished enemies, and tried to restore a balance that had been disturbed by movements beyond its direct sight. Frontier peoples were not a single mass waiting outside civilization. They were communities with leaders, rivalries, pressures, and needs of their own, sometimes trading with Rome, sometimes serving in its armies, sometimes crossing against it when opportunity or necessity arose. The imperial border was a relationship before it was a line. Marcus's choice of successor ended the remembered age of adoptive emperors. His son Commodus inherited in 010 CE, and because he was the biological son of a respected emperor, his accession followed a natural dynastic path. That path had always remained available beneath the praise of adoption. No Roman law required the emperor to choose the best adult in the empire, and no habit of good succession could erase the desire to pass power through blood. The age praised for adopted merit ended when a father left power to his son. Commodus's reign damaged the memory of what had come before. Ancient senatorial writers portrayed him as vain, suspicious, and absorbed in performance, especially in the arena where imperial dignity seemed to descend into display. His government included capable ministers at times, and the empire did not collapse immediately under him. But the relationship between ruler, senate, army, and public image grew unstable. After the moral seriousness attached to Marcus, Commodus became a figure through whom later Romans explained decline, even when the causes of imperial strain were wider than one man. His assassination in 192 CE brought the long 2nd century to an unsettled close. The empire that had seemed so steady under Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus had depended on more than virtue, but virtue, or at least competence, had mattered. Succession, army loyalty, fiscal balance, frontier management, urban prosperity, legal expectation, and provincial cooperation had all worked together for several generations with unusual success. Commodus did not destroy that machinery by himself. He revealed how much the machinery still needed a ruler who did not misuse the central place it gave him. The age of wide frontiers therefore leaves a double impression. It was the period of Rome's greatest territorial reach, of great roads and walls, of administrative maturity, of provincial elites rising into Roman honor, and of law becoming one of empire's most durable languages. It was also an age in which expansion became burden. Disease traveled through connection, frontier pressure never ceased, and succession remained the old unsolved question beneath every polished title. The empire had never looked more complete. It had also never been clearer that completeness required constant maintenance. When the discipline of the adoptive age failed and Commodus revealed the emperor's vulnerability, the armies whose loyalty had secured the wide frontiers remembered their power, shattering the invented peace and ushering in an age of constant military strain. Chapter 9: Soldiers, Silver, and the 3rd Century Strain. Septimius Severus came to power through civil war, and he never allowed the empire to forget that soldiers had carried him there. After Commodus's assassination in 192 CE, Rome passed through a brief and revealing confusion in which Pertinax tried to restore discipline, the Praetorian Guard murdered him, and Didius Julianus gained the throne in a manner later remembered as a purchase from the men who guarded the palace. The spectacle wounded the dignity of imperial rule. It also made plain what had always been true beneath the ceremonies of succession. The emperor needed armed men to accept him. Severus was in Pannonia when the crisis opened. Born at Lepsis Magna in North Africa, married into a Syrian family, and commanding Danubian legions, he represented an empire whose ruling class had widened far beyond the old Roman and Italian core. His rival claimants, Pescennius Niger in the east and Clodius Albinus in the west, drew strength from other regional armies and aristocratic expectations. The contest that followed was not a rebellion against Rome by outsiders, but a Roman civil war fought through the empire's own provincial depth. The center had become wherever the strongest army could march from. In 93 CE, Severus entered Rome, dismissed and replaced the Praetorian Guard, and presented himself as the avenger of Pertinax. He understood symbols carefully. By honoring the murdered emperor and punishing the guards who had sold their loyalty too openly, he turned his own military seizure of power into a restoration of seriousness. Yet he also enlarged soldiers' pay, favored the army, and advised his sons, according to later tradition, to enrich the soldiers and disregard the rest. Whether or not the words were exactly spoken, they fit the reign's political truth. Julia Domna, Severus's wife, belonged to the priestly aristocracy of Emesa in Syria, and her presence at court gave the dynasty a cultural range that older Roman moralists would have found difficult to classify. She traveled with Severus, received titles, patronized intellectuals, and became part of the imperial image as mother of the camps and mother of the imperial household. Her circle included Greek-speaking scholars, lawyers, and philosophers, reminding us that Roman power in this period was not narrow in language or geography. The imperial court gathered North Africa, Syria, Greece, Italy, and the Danube into one moving center of favor. Severus fought in the east against Niger, then in the west against Albinus, and finally against Parthia, where he took Ctesiphon and strengthened Roman prestige along the eastern frontier. Later he campaigned in Britain, an old province with a difficult northern border, and died at Eboracum, modern York, in 211 CE. His last years at the edge of the empire show the altered geography of imperial rule. An emperor from Africa, married to a Syrian noblewoman, commanding Danubian soldiers, could die in Britain while ruling a state that still called itself Roman without hesitation. His sons inherited together, and the arrangement soon failed. Caracalla and Geta had been raised under the same dynastic roof, but shared rule required restraint that neither possessed in sufficient measure. In 211 CE, Geta was killed in the presence of their mother, and Caracalla became sole ruler. The private cruelty of that family moment should be touched only briefly, because its public consequence matters more here. Geta's memory was condemned, his images erased where possible, and the imperial household showed again how succession could turn kinship into danger. Caracalla's reign is remembered for harshness, military favor, and one enormous legal act. In 212 CE, the Constitutio Antoniniana extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. The grant sounded immense, and in one sense it was. A status once carefully layered, fought for by Italian allies, earned by auxiliary soldiers, or bestowed as privilege now became nearly universal among the free population. Rome had spent centuries widening citizenship. Caracalla made the widening almost complete. The meaning of the edict was not only generous or philosophical. Citizenship carried fiscal consequences, especially in relation to inheritance and manumission taxes, and it also reflected a world in which the old distinction between Roman citizen and provincial subject had lost much of its administrative usefulness. When nearly everyone became Roman, the word changed weight. It no longer marked a narrow legal elite within the empire, but a broad condition under imperial rule. The act was one of Rome's most remarkable transformations, and also one of the clearest signs that conquest had remade the conqueror's identity. Coinage tells another part of the story. Caracalla introduced the Antoninianus, a silver coin valued above the denarius but containing less silver than its face value implied. This was not yet the full monetary disorder of later decades, but it belonged to a long pattern of fiscal pressure, military expense, and the temptation to stretch precious metal further than trust could easily bear. Coins carried imperial portraits and claims of victory, harmony, and abundance. Their metal content carried quieter messages about strain. After Caracalla's assassination in 217 CE, the Severan house continued through women, soldiers, and hurried legitimacy. Macrinus, a praetorian prefect, briefly held power, but Julia Maesa, sister of Julia Domna, helped restore the dynasty by promoting her grandson Elagabalus. The young emperor, associated with the Syrian sun god of Emesa, brought religious forms and court behavior that scandalized many Roman observers. Ancient accounts are hostile, often lurid, and difficult to trust in detail, yet they preserve a real discomfort with an emperor whose sacred authority seemed to come from outside the religious habits the Roman elite recognized as proper. Elagabalus was killed in 222 CE and replaced by his cousin Alexander Severus, guided at first by his mother Julia Mamaea and by advisors who tried to restore senatorial respectability. The reign sought moderation, legal order, and a calmer court image, but the empire's frontiers were becoming less forgiving. In the east, the Sasanian dynasty replaced the Parthians and brought a more aggressive Persian power to Rome's border. Along the Rhine and Danube, Germanic groups pressed, raided, negotiated, and tested Roman response. A mild emperor could not make the world mild by disposition alone. Alexander Severus was murdered by soldiers in 235 CE after dissatisfaction with his handling of northern threats. His death opened what later historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a name that can make the decades sound more coherent than they felt to those living inside them. Emperors rose from the army and fell by the army. Some ruled for months, some for a few years, and many died violently. The purple became not only a dignity but a danger, because the same troops who elevated a commander could abandon him when fortune turned. Maximinus Thrax, a soldier of Balkan or Thracian background, followed Alexander and embodied the changed path to power. He was remembered as physically imposing, rough in manner, and distant from senatorial culture, though hostile elite sources likely sharpened that contrast. His reign signaled that the army on the frontier could make an emperor without waiting for the old aristocratic center to approve. Rome still possessed the Senate, temples, courts, and ceremonies, but imperial legitimacy increasingly rose from camps where soldiers cared more for pay, victory, and presence than for polished ancestry. The year 238 CE exposed the instability with unusual clarity. Revolt in Africa raised the Gordians, senatorial opposition gathered, Maximinus marched, and several emperors passed across the stage in rapid succession before Gordian III emerged as the surviving ruler. The details are tangled, but the pattern is not. Different parts of the empire could now generate claims to authority under stress, and the capital could no longer assume that recognition flowed outward from Rome in an orderly way. Power moved along military roads and through regional emergencies. External pressure deepened the internal disorder. The Sasanians under Shapur has challenged Rome in the east with energy and royal confidence. In 260 CE, Emperor Valerian was captured by Shapur after the Roman defeat near Edessa, an event almost unthinkable in earlier imperial self-understanding. An emperor taken alive by a foreign king did more than damage Roman prestige. It revealed that the imperial office, however exalted in ceremony, remained vulnerable to bad logistics, disease, misjudgment, and the hard fact of defeat. Gallienus, Valerian's son, ruled amid these dangers and is often judged through the difficulty of his times. He faced invasions, usurpations, plague, and the fragmentation of imperial authority. Yet he also pursued military reforms, relying more heavily on mobile cavalry forces and excluding senators from many military commands. That exclusion marked a real shift. The old aristocratic ideal of the senator general receded, while professional military command drew closer to men whose careers belonged to the army itself. The empire was becoming more openly governed by those who could defend it. The so-called Gallic Empire arose in the west under Postumus after 260 CE, including Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain at various points. Its rulers minted coins, held offices, defended frontiers, and claimed Roman legitimacy rather than rejecting it. This is worth pausing over, because fragmentation did not mean that provincial Romans stopped thinking in Roman forms. Postumus did not present himself as king of a new barbarian realm. He presented himself as an emperor for a region that believed a central government could no longer protect it adequately. In the east, Palmyra rose in a different but related way. The city had long prospered through caravan trade, connecting the Roman world with routes toward Mesopotamia, Persia, and beyond. Its wealth could be seen in monumental colonnades, inscriptions, temples, and the mixed cultural forms of a desert city that belonged to several worlds at once. Under Odenathus, Palmyra helped stabilize the east after Valerian's capture, fighting the Persians while remaining, at least formally, within Roman loyalty. After his death, Zenobia emerged as the dominant figure in Palmyrene power. Zenobia's rule carried ambition with care. Acting in the name of her son Verbalathus, she extended influence over Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor, using Roman titles and local prestige while building a position too large for the Central Empire to tolerate indefinitely. Ancient sources later colored her with admiration and suspicion, making her learned, queenly, foreign, and dangerous in different measures. The historical shape is enough without ornament. At a moment when Rome could not easily hold its eastern provinces, Palmyra held them in Roman language under Palmyrene command. Inside the ordinary lives of the empire, these divisions must have been felt unevenly. Some cities saw new walls raised or old circuits repaired because insecurity had moved closer to civic life. Coin hoards buried and never recovered suggest fear, savings, or disruption at moments when owners did not return. Inscriptions became less plentiful in some regions, public buildings slowed, and local communities adjusted to tax demands, soldiers' needs, and uncertainty over whose authority would arrive next. Crisis was not one experience repeated everywhere. It was a weather of instability passing with different force through different provinces. Plague also marked the century. The disease, sometimes called the Plague of Cyprian, after the bishop of Carthage who described its effects in the mid-3rd century, added demographic and emotional strain to military and fiscal trouble. Ancient descriptions reflect moral and religious interpretation as much as observation, and the exact disease remains debated. Its significance for the empire lies in accumulation. Armies, tax systems, farms, cities, and households all depended on human numbers and confidence, and epidemic mortality weakened both. The debasement of coinage worsened under pressure. The silver content of coins declined, prices became harder to trust, and payment in kind grew more important in some contexts. A soldier paid in weak coin, a taxpayer assessed more heavily, a merchant uncertain of value, and a city trying to fund repairs all belonged to the same imperial problem. Money was a promise stamped with an emperor's face. When the metal thinned, the promise did not vanish at once, but it began to require more force and habit to sustain. Aurelian, who became emperor in 270 CE, brought the century one of its strongest restorations. Born in the Danubian military world, he belonged to the line of soldier emperors whose legitimacy came from command under pressure. He defeated invading groups in Italy and the Balkans, then turned against Palmyra. Zenobia's forces were overcome. Palmyra was brought back under imperial authority, and the eastern provinces returned to the central empire. The victory was not merely military. It restored the idea that Rome could still gather what had slipped from its hands. Aurelian then moved against the Gallic Empire, whose ruler Tetricus submitted after the Battle of Chalons in 274 CE. With that, the Western breakaway regime ended, and the empire, at least formally, was whole again. Aurelian celebrated a triumph that displayed captives, victories, and restored unity, including Zenobia herself in later accounts. The ceremony belongs to the old Roman language of conquest, but its meaning had changed. Rome was now celebrating the recovery of Roman provinces from Roman-framed separatist powers. The walls Aurelian built around Rome are among the most telling monuments of the age. Earlier imperial Rome had not needed such a circuit in the same way, because the city's security rested on the distance of frontiers and the assumption that danger belonged far away. Beginning in the 270s, the new walls enclosed the capital with brick-faced concrete, towers, gates, and the sober recognition that even Rome might require immediate defense. A wall is a practical structure, but it is also an admission. The center had become a place to guard. Aurelian promoted the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, giving religious expression to unity, victory, and imperial recovery. The sun god's imagery appeared on coins and in public association with the emperor's restored order. This did not make the empire monotheistic, nor did it erase older cults, but it showed the imperial search for symbols broad enough to speak across a varied world. In a century of fracture, religious language could help represent coherence that politics had struggled to maintain. His reign ended in assassination in 275 CE, a familiar Roman ending even after uncommon success. The empire he left was reunited but not healed in any simple sense. The problems of succession, frontier pressure, military expense, currency, taxation, and administrative scale remained. Yet Aurelian had proved that the Roman state could still recover from division. That proof mattered. Empires endure not because they never break, but because sometimes, after breaking, they still possess the means to draw themselves together again. The decades after Commodus therefore transformed the imperial world. The Severans made the army's centrality plainer. Caracalla widened citizenship until Roman identity became nearly universal among free inhabitants. Soldier emperors rose from the frontiers, coinage weakened, plague and invasion pressed against public confidence, and breakaway empires in Gaul and Palmyra used Roman forms while separating from Roman command. Nothing in this history is tidy enough to be called simple decline. It is better understood as strain, improvisation, and survival under conditions the Augustan system had never been built to meet. By the end of the 3rd century crisis, Rome was still there, but it was no longer the same empire that Trajan or Antoninus Pius had governed. The Senate had lost much of its military role. The emperor belonged more visibly to the army. The provinces had learned that local security might require regional power. Citizenship had widened, money had thinned, and walls had risen around cities that once trusted distance. The empire continued, but it continued by becoming harder, more military, more bureaucratic, and more willing to abandon older elegance for endurance. This new, hardened state, militarized and bureaucratic, demanded a complete structural redesign, leading its most successful rulers to multiply power, divide administration, and look toward a new center of gravity far from Rome. Chapter 10. New capitals, new gods, new forms of rule. By the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire had survived division, plague, invasion, monetary weakness, and a long procession of emperors whose reigns often ended before their policies could settle. The recovery under Aurelian showed that imperial command still possessed force, but force alone could not make the old system adequate again. A single emperor moving from frontier to frontier could win battles and issue orders, yet the empire had become too large, too pressured, and too administratively dense for rule to depend on one man's movement and one court's attention. What was needed was not merely a stronger emperor, but a different arrangement of imperial power. Diocletian, who became emperor in 284 CE, came from the military world of the Balkans, the same hard school that had produced many of the soldier emperors before him. His rise followed the death of Numerian and the defeat of Carinus, and it belonged to the violent habits of the century he inherited. Yet Diocletian's importance lies not in another accession by the army, but in the scale of the answer he gave to the empire's disorder. He did not pretend that Rome could return to the simpler elegance of Augustus. He accepted, with unusual clarity, that survival required more government. The first major step was collegial rule. Diocletian elevated Maximian as co-emperor, first as Caesar and then as Augustus, dividing responsibility between East and West while preserving the idea of one Roman Empire. This was not a partition in the later sense, and it was not meant to create separate states. It was a practical recognition that the Rhine, Danube, Syria, Egypt, Africa, Britain, and Italy could not all be watched adequately from a single imperial center. The empire remained one in law and ideology, but its defense required more than one imperial presence. In 293 CE, the arrangement widened into the Tetrarchy. Diocletian and Maximian stood as senior emperors, Augusti, while Galerius and Constantius Chlorus became junior emperors, Caesars, each attached to a region and a military responsibility. The system gave the empire 4 rulers, 4 courts, and a planned method of succession. It also gave the public a new image of authority. Instead of one singular princeps carefully veiled in republican language, the tetrarchs appeared as a disciplined college of rulers, similar in dress, posture, and purpose. Their unity presented almost as a political virtue in itself. The famous porphyry image of the tetrarchs, later carried to Venice, captures that message in compact form. The figures are not individualized like the polished portraits of earlier emperors. They embrace, grip swords, and wear the same military dress, their faces broad and severe, their bodies made to speak of solidarity rather than personal charm. The art is often called stiff when compared with classical portraiture, but that judgment misses its political intelligence. After a century of usurpation, personality had become dangerous. The tetrarchic image offered agreement, hierarchy, and shared command. Imperial residences also moved away from Rome. Diocletian ruled often from Nicomedia in Asia Minor, Galerius from the Balkans, Maximian from Milan, and Constantius from Trier or other Western centers. Rome remained sacred, ancient, and ceremonially irreplaceable, but it was no longer the daily workshop of empire. Power settled closer to frontiers, armies, and administrative routes. A petitioner, officer, or provincial delegation might now look toward Milan, Trier, Sirmium, Antioch, or Nicomedia rather than imagining every road ending in the old capital. This movement changed the emotional geography of Roman rule. For centuries, Rome had been more than a city. It had been the symbol through which conquest understood itself. Yet the later empire was discovering that reverence and usefulness were not the same thing. The old capital could still receive monuments, anniversaries, senatorial honors, and imperial visits, but emperors needed to live where decisions were urgent. A court near the Rhine or in Asia Minor could answer dangers that Rome, in its venerable distance, could only hear about after delay. Diocletian's administrative reforms carried the same spirit of multiplication. Provinces were divided into smaller units, making governors less powerful and administration more manageable. These provinces were grouped into dioceses under vicaria, and the distinction between civil and military authority became more pronounced. The old large provinces of the early empire, where a governor might possess considerable prestige and resources, no longer suited an age suspicious of usurpation and pressed by local complexity. Smaller jurisdictions made rebellion harder and taxation more detailed. Taxation became one of the central burdens of the new order. The empire needed armies, officials, roads, fortifications, arms factories, and court establishments, and these required a more regular extraction of resources. Diocletian's tax system assessed land and people in ways meant to produce predictable obligations, often paid in kind as well as in coin. Grain, animals, cloth, labor, and transport could all belong to the fiscal life of the state. To those who paid, reform may have felt less like order than weight, but the government's need was clear enough. An empire that wished to endure had to know what it could collect. The Price Edict of 301 CE shows both ambition and anxiety. Issued in an attempt to restrain inflation and regulate the maximum prices of goods and services, it listed wages, foods, textiles, transport costs, animals, and many ordinary commodities across a vast range of economic life. The surviving inscriptions preserve a government trying to command value itself, as if the disorder of money could be corrected by public words cut into stone. The edict did not solve the empire's economic problems, but it reveals the late Roman state's confidence in regulation and its fear that unmeasured exchange could become another form of instability. Military reform was equally important. The details remain debated, and later developments are not always easy to assign neatly to Diocletian himself, but the broad direction is visible. Frontier forces continued to guard the borders, while more mobile field armies developed around imperial presence and strategic need. Fortifications were strengthened, supply became more organized, and recruitment tied communities more closely to military obligations. The army was not merely a fighting force. It was the greatest institution of the empire, a consumer of taxes, a maker of emperors, and the practical reason so much administration existed. With greater hierarchy came a different ceremonial style. The emperor was no longer presented as the first citizen moving among other citizens with carefully managed modesty. Access became more formal, court ritual more elevated, and the ruler's person more distant. Prostration, elaborate address, jeweled dress, and guarded audiences belonged to a political language that earlier Romans might have associated with Eastern monarchy, though Rome had long been moving in this direction. The change can look like vanity from far away, but it also served a purpose. In an age when emperors had been made and killed too easily, majesty became a shield around the office. Religion stood inside this effort to secure unity. Diocletian and his colleagues associated themselves with traditional gods, especially Jupiter and Hercules, as divine patrons of the senior rulers. The old cults were not merely private beliefs, they were part of public order, military oath, civic identity, and imperial legitimacy. Christianity, which had grown across the empire through cities, households, trade routes, and local communities, did not fit easily into that inherited structure because Christians could refuse sacrifice to the gods who guarded the state. What had once seemed a small or local matter now appeared to some rulers as a political problem. The Great Persecution began in 303 CE. Churches were ordered destroyed, scriptures surrendered, clergy arrested, and sacrifice demanded in various degrees across the empire. The severity differed by region and ruler, with Galerius especially associated with harsh enforcement, while Constantius in the west appears to have acted more mildly. The persecution should not be rendered as spectacle. Its significance lies in the state's final major attempt to restore religious conformity by administrative force, and in the discovery that Christian communities had become too rooted to be removed by decree. Diocletian's abdication in 305 CE was one of the most remarkable acts in Roman imperial history. He stepped down voluntarily, compelling Maximian to do the same, and allowed the Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, to become Augusti while new Caesars were appointed beneath them. The plan was austere and rational: succession without murder, retirement without civil war, continuity through office rather than blood. Diocletian withdrew to his palace at Split, near the Dalmatian coast, where later tradition imagined him tending cabbages with more satisfaction than he found in rule. The image is probably too neat, but the abdication itself was real enough, and it tested whether the tetrarchy could outlive its maker's authority. It could not do so for long. The system had tried to suppress dynastic expectation, but emperors had sons, soldiers had loyalties, and regions had preferences. When Constantius Chlorus died at York in 306 CE, his troops acclaimed his son Constantine. In Rome, Maxentius, son of Maximian, claimed power with support from the Praetorian Guard and the city's discontent. Maximian himself returned from retirement. Galerius, Severus, Licinius, and others moved within the fractured arrangement. The tetrarchy had multiplied rulers to prevent usurpation, but it had also multiplied the number of men close enough to power to claim it. Constantine's rise unfolded through patience, war, alliance, and careful self-presentation. Born to Constantius and Helena, he had spent time in the Eastern imperial court before joining his father in the West. His early power rested in Britain, Gaul, and the loyalty of troops who had accepted him after Constantius' death. He did not at once control the Roman world. He moved through it step by step, presenting himself as legitimate heir, capable commander, and favored ruler while the old tetrarchic structure lost coherence around him. The confrontation with Maxentius brought Constantine to Italy in 31 CE. Maxentius held Rome, but his legitimacy was troubled, and Constantine advanced south through northern Italy before approaching the city. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge, fought near the Tiber, became one of the most remembered battles in Roman history because later Christian sources connected it with a divine sign and Constantine's adoption of Christian symbols. The exact nature of his vision or dream remains difficult to recover through sources shaped by theology and imperial memory. What can be said calmly is that Constantine won, Maxentius died, and the victory joined imperial power to the Christian God in a new and lasting way. Rome received Constantine as liberator from Maxentius, and the Senate honored him with monuments, including the Arch of Constantine. That arch reused sculptural reliefs from earlier emperors, especially Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, setting Constantine inside the visual memory of good rule. The reuse was not merely economy. It placed a new ruler within an old imperial lineage, as though stone itself could help explain continuity. Rome was changing again, but it preferred to make change look inherited. In 313 CE, Constantine and Licinius issued what is usually called the Edict of Milan, though the surviving form is more accurately a letter of policy granting religious toleration and restoring Christian property. The age of official persecution ended. Christianity did not instantly become the empire's only religion, nor did traditional cult disappear from public life at once. But the direction had changed. A faith once punished by imperial authority could now receive imperial favor, legal protection, gifts, buildings, and the attention of emperors who understood that bishops had become figures of public importance. Christian meeting places began to change with patronage. Before imperial favor, Christian communities had gathered in houses, adapted halls, symmetrical spaces, and modest local settings, varying by region and circumstance. Under Constantine, monumental basilicas began to rise, especially in Rome, Jerusalem, and the new imperial centers. The basilica form, already familiar as a public hall, suited Christian assembly without depending on the architectural language of pagan temples. A religion of households, scriptures, bishops, martyrs, and local communities began to acquire roofs, columns, courts, and endowments on an imperial scale. The relationship between emperor and church did not become simple. Constantine favored Christianity, endowed churches, supported clergy, and involved himself in disputes, but he was not a bishop, and the church was not merely an office of the state. The Donatist controversy in North Africa showed early how difficult Christian division could be for a ruler who valued unity. Bishops appealed to imperial authority, councils judged, and dissatisfied communities resisted decisions. The emperor could convene, fund, pressure, and enforce, but theological conviction did not always yield to administrative settlement. Licinius, who had shared power with Constantine after years of conflict among the tetrarchic rulers, eventually became his rival. Their wars ended in 324 CE with Constantine's victory and Licinius's defeat. For the first time since Diocletian's experiment, the Roman Empire again had one ruler. Yet the empire Constantine governed was not the empire Diocletian had inherited. It was more bureaucratic, more court-centered, more openly hierarchical, more Christian in imperial favor, and less tied to Rome as an administrative center. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE revealed the new shape of imperial religious politics. Bishops gathered from across the empire to address the Arian controversy, especially the question of the son's relationship to the father, a theological dispute whose language was precise because the stakes were immense. Constantine presided not as a theologian of equal standing, but as emperor seeking unity in the church that he had chosen to favor. The resulting creed did not end disagreement, but it gave imperial support to a standard of orthodoxy and made councils part of the machinery by which Christian truth and Roman order would meet. There is something striking in the sight of bishops traveling under imperial summons to settle doctrine with the emperor's attention upon them. A century earlier, Christian leaders had faced confiscation and arrest under the state's suspicion. Now they moved within the protection and expectation of the court. The change was not merely a reversal of fortune. It altered both empire and church, because Roman authority gained a new religious language, while Christian leadership entered the realm of patronage, privilege, and imperial pressure. Constantine's new capital made the change visible in geography. On the site of Byzantium, an old Greek city commanding the Bosporus, he founded Constantinople, dedicated in 330 CE. The location was extraordinary, between Europe and Asia, near the Danube and eastern frontiers, connected to Black Sea and Mediterranean routes, defensible by land and water, and distant from the senatorial weight of old Rome. The new city did not abolish Rome's sacred status, but it gave the empire a second center shaped by Constantine's own authority. The dedication of Constantinople combined Roman ceremony, imperial ambition, and the careful layering of old and new. Statues and artworks were gathered, forums laid out, palaces built, walls planned, and administrative institutions established to make the city worthy of imperial residence. Its senate would grow in importance, its churches would multiply, and its position would allow later Eastern emperors to endure long after the Western court had faded. For this episode, however, the point is not to enter Byzantine history. It is to notice that the Roman Empire, still one empire under Constantine, had placed its future center far from the city that gave it a name. Constantine's family policy, like that of earlier emperors, carried danger inside succession. He elevated sons and relatives, arranged dynastic honors, and created expectations that would shape the empire after his death. The old tetrarchic rejection of bloodline had failed, and Constantine returned to dynasty without returning to the Augustan world. His heirs would inherit a Christianizing, militarized, bureaucratic empire with multiple courts and strong regional commands. No legal formula could remove the danger that brothers, cousins, armies, and ministers would contest the meaning of inheritance. His coinage and public imagery changed gradually rather than all at once. Sol Invictus remained visible in earlier years. Christian symbols appeared with increasing importance, and the emperor's portrait continued to speak in the language of victory, order, and divine favor. This gradual quality matters. Religious transformation in the empire was not a single door opening cleanly. It was a long corridor of overlapping signs where old cults, solar language, Christian patronage, military loyalty, and imperial ceremony coexisted before later laws sharpened the boundaries. In 337 CE, Constantine died near Nicomedia after receiving baptism, according to the common account from Eusebius of Nicomedia. His death closed one of the most consequential reigns in Roman history. Diocletian had redesigned the imperial state to survive crisis. Constantine had taken that redesigned state and attached it to a new religious future while founding a new capital. Neither man restored the old Rome. Both preserved Roman power by making it less recognizable to those who still imagined the world of Augustus. The empire that emerged from their reforms was more durable in some ways and heavier in others. It could tax more regularly, command more officials, maintain multiple courts, and defend several frontiers with a more developed military structure. It could also burden communities, bind occupations, formalize hierarchy, and make the state feel closer to daily life than the High Empire had done. A farmer assessed in kind, a city council responsible for collection, a soldier attached to frontier service, a bishop called into council, and an official writing from a provincial bureau all belonged to this late Roman order. Rome itself remained powerful as memory. Senators still valued its honors, old temples still stood, aristocratic houses still carried ancient names, and imperial anniversaries still drew meaning from the city's past. Yet power had learned to live elsewhere. It lived in Trier with the western armies, in Milan near the northern approaches to Italy, in Nicomedia near the eastern routes, and then in Constantinople, where the Bosporus held ships, soldiers, merchants, bishops, officials, and ceremonies in a new arrangement of Roman space. The changes of Diocletian and Constantine did not end the Roman Empire's problems. They made a new empire capable of meeting them for a time. Succession remained dangerous, frontiers remained active, taxation remained burdensome, religious unity remained elusive, and the difference between Eastern and Western resources would grow sharper in the centuries ahead. But the empire had once again done what it had done many times before. Under pressure, it had altered its own form and insisted that the altered form was still Rome. The empire's renewed insistence on continuity was immediately tested by the dangers Constantinian reforms had amplified, the increasing influence of theological disputes, and the immense pressure of migrating peoples along the Danube frontier. Chapter 11. Bishops, Goths, and Divided Courts. A basilica, a military camp, and an imperial audience chamber all belonged to the later Roman world, and power moved among them with increasing ease. After Constantine, the empire did not become peaceful because it had gained a Christian emperor, nor did it become simple because it possessed a new capital. It remained a vast Roman state of armies, taxes, laws, cities, frontiers, ceremonies, and rival claims to legitimacy. What changed was the language through which authority explained itself, and the institutions that stood near the emperor when public order was discussed. Constantine's sons inherited a world their father had made larger in ceremony and more dangerous in succession. Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II divided authority after the purges and arrangements that followed their father's death in 337 CE, and the dynasty soon settled into conflict. The old problem had returned in Christian imperial dress. The empire could imagine unity more easily than it could pass power without rivalry. Brothers, cousins, soldiers, and court officials all stood close enough to the throne to make kinship a source of danger rather than rest. Constantius II eventually became sole ruler, and his long reign showed how difficult religious unity could be when imperial favor attached itself to doctrine. The Arian controversy did not fade after Nicaea. Bishops, councils, exiles, petitions, creeds, and court influence continued to shape the argument over how the son related to the father, and imperial pressure could move bishops from one city to another as surely as military orders moved soldiers along a road. The theological language was exact, but the political setting was familiar. Rome had always governed through offices and written formulas. Now some of the most contested formulas concerned divine nature. The court itself had become more formal than in the age of Augustus or even Trajan. Officials controlled access, ceremonial ranks multiplied, and imperial letters traveled through a bureaucracy that expected obedience from men who might never see the ruler's face. The late empire's titles can seem dense from a distance, yet each marked a place in a hierarchy that made power legible to those inside it. A count, a prefect, a master of soldiers, a notary, a provincial governor, a bishop with imperial access, all belonged to the ordered crowd around authority. Julian, the cousin of Constantius, entered this world as a survivor of dynastic suspicion. Much of his family had been removed in the violent aftermath of Constantine's death, and he was raised under watchful conditions before being given education steeped in Greek literature and philosophy. When Constantius made him Caesar in the West in 355 CE, Julian seemed to many a scholarly young man placed in a military role beyond his preparation. Yet in Gaul, he proved energetic and capable, restoring discipline, campaigning on the Rhine, and winning at Argentoratum near Strasbourg in 357 CE. His soldiers acclaimed him Augustus in 360 CE, and a civil war with Constantius seemed possible until Constantius died in 361. Julian then became sole emperor and revealed more openly the religious convictions that had set him apart from Constantine's heirs. He had turned toward traditional cults and philosophical paganism, and he hoped to restore the old gods to public honor. His program was not a simple return to the past, because the past he loved had already become an intellectual and moral construction. He reorganized priesthoods, encouraged sacrifice, criticized Christian divisions, and tried to make pagan religious life more disciplined, charitable, and socially coherent. Julian's brief reign is one of the more delicate moments in Roman religious history. He did not reign long enough to remake the empire, and his pagan revival depended heavily on his own energy. Yet it shows that the Christian direction of imperial power was not felt as inevitable by everyone living inside the 4th century. For some educated elites, the gods, temples, sacrifices, and philosophical traditions of the older world still carried intellectual beauty and civic memory. Constantine had changed the empire's direction, but memory did not obey as quickly as law. In 363 CE, Julian led a campaign against Persia, hoping to match the military glory of earlier emperors and perhaps secure his religious and political authority through victory. The campaign moved deep into Mesopotamia and became increasingly difficult as supply and strategy turned against the Romans. Julian was wounded and died during the retreat, leaving the army in enemy territory without a settled succession. His death ended the last serious imperial attempt to restore traditional cult as the guiding religious language of the Roman state. It also reminded the empire that a ruler's vision, however intense, could pass away in a single campaign season. Jovian, chosen by the army, made peace with Persia on costly terms and restored Christian favor, but his reign was brief. Valentinian I then came to power in 364 and chose his brother Valens to rule the East, establishing a division of responsibility that reflected the empire's practical needs. Valentinian governed from western centers such as Milan and Trier, close to the Rhine and Danube concerns, while Valens ruled from the east, where Persian relations and Balkan pressures demanded attention. The empire remained one Roman world in ideology, yet its daily governance increasingly depended on separate courts facing different troubles. Valentinian was a soldier emperor in the later style, severe, energetic, and attentive to frontiers. Along the Rhine and Danube, he strengthened defenses, built fortifications, and dealt with Alemanni, Quadi, and other groups who moved between negotiation and conflict with Rome. Frontier policy in this period was not a simple story of barbarians outside and Romans inside. Traders crossed, envoys came and went, recruits entered Roman service, captives returned, hostages were exchanged, and local commanders learned the habits of neighboring peoples. The frontier was a zone of pressure, but also of familiarity. Valens faced a different crisis when Gothic groups, pressed by Hunnic movements beyond the Danube, sought entry into Roman territory in 3076 CE. The Goths who crossed were not a single shapeless mass, but communities with leaders, families, dependents, warriors, and expectations formed by prior dealings with Rome. They were allowed to enter under Roman supervision, but the settlement was badly managed. Corrupt officials, food shortages, exploitation, and mistrust turned an emergency migration into rebellion. A Roman state skilled in classification had failed at the human work of reception and supply. The disaster that followed reached its decisive moment at Adrianople in 378 CE. Valens, seeking victory before Western reinforcements arrived, engaged the Gothic forces and suffered a defeat that stunned the empire. He died in the battle, and a large part of the Eastern Field Army was lost. The importance of Adrianople does not lie in one simple claim that cavalry had ended the Roman legion, or that the empire was suddenly doomed. Its meaning is steadier and more administrative. A settlement failure, a frontier crisis, and an emperor's impatience had combined to damage the army on which the eastern state depended. Ammianus Marcellinus, the soldier historian who wrote of these decades, gives the later 4th century one of its clearest voices. He had served in the army, knew the eastern and western worlds of imperial command, and wrote in Latin with admiration for Rome and concern over its failings. Through him, the empire appears not as a symbol, but as a working state filled with campaigns, messengers, omens, officers, cities, intrigues, and human misjudgments. His history closes not long after Adrianople, as though the record itself pauses before the consequences fully unfold. Theodosius was appointed Eastern Emperor in 379 CE to repair what Valens had left broken. He could not simply expel or destroy all the Goths who had entered imperial territory, and the settlement reached in 382 allowed Gothic groups to live within the empire under terms that preserved a degree of their own leadership while obligating them to military service. The arrangement was practical and uneasy. Rome had long incorporated outsiders, but the scale and form of this settlement felt different to many observers, because armed groups inside the empire could not always be absorbed into ordinary provincial life. Theodosius also gave Christian imperial policy a sharper Nicene form. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380, issued with Gratian and Valentinian II, declared the faith associated with the bishops of Rome and Alexandria to be the religion the empire should follow. Laws against heresy and sacrifice followed in stages, and traditional public cults lost legal and financial support. The change was not experienced everywhere in one moment, because temples, local habits, aristocratic loyalties, and rural practices endured unevenly. Still, the direction of imperial authority had become clear. The Roman state now spoke for Christian orthodoxy with a confidence that Constantine had opened but not completed. Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, revealed the new moral authority bishops could exercise near the court. A former governor turned bishop, he possessed administrative skill, aristocratic bearing, and theological firmness. His conflicts with imperial power were not struggles between a weak church and an all-powerful state, because by his time the church had become an institution with property, crowds, sacred authority, and public voice. Milan, where emperors often resided, made the bishop's presence especially important. An emperor ruling near Ambrose could not pretend that religious authority was distant. The massacre at Thessalonica in 390 CE became the moment most closely associated with Ambrose's rebuke of Theodosius. After violence in the city against an imperial official, troops carried out a punishment that later tradition remembered as terrible in scale. Ambrose refused easy reconciliation and required the emperor to perform penance before returning fully to communion. The details have been shaped by Christian memory, but the public meaning endured. A Roman emperor, heir to centuries of command, stood under the judgment of a bishop in a matter of sin and repentance. This did not mean the church ruled the empire. Theodosius remained emperor. Armies still obeyed generals, Taxes still sustained courts, and law still moved through imperial offices. But a new relationship had entered Roman politics. Public authority now had to answer, at least at times, to a moral language guarded by bishops who claimed a loyalty higher than imperial favor. For a state that had once treated priesthoods as part of civic order, this was a remarkable transformation. Sacred authority had not left politics. It had changed its institutional home. In the West, Gratian, Valentinian II, and then the usurper Magnus Maximus revealed the continued instability of imperial division. Armies in Britain, Gaul, and the Danube regions could still elevate claimants, and Western courts relied heavily on generals who commanded troops more effectively than young or embattled emperors could. Theodosius defeated Maximus in 388 and later defeated Eugenius and Arbogast in 394, briefly restoring unity under his own rule. These victories gave him the appearance of a final unifier. Yet the unity was personal, not structural, and it faded as soon as he died. The Battle of the Frigidus in 394, fought against Eugenius and the powerful general Arbogast, later acquired religious coloring as a victory for Christian empire over pagan sympathies, though the reality was politically layered. Soldiers from different regions, including Gothic contingents under leaders such as Alaric, served in Theodosius' forces. The empire's armies were now composite in ways that earlier Roman writers would have found uneasy but necessary. Men who might be described as barbarians could be essential to Roman victory, and their service did not erase their own ambitions. When Theodosius died in 395 CE, his sons Arcadius and Honorius inherited east and west respectively. Arcadius ruled from Constantinople, while Honorius, still a child, depended in the west on the general Stilicho, a man of Vandal background deeply embedded in Roman service. This arrangement shows the late empire without the simplifications later history often imposes. Roman power was defended by men of non-Roman ancestry. Christian courts quarreled with each other, and emperors with ancient titles relied on military households whose loyalties were personal, regional, and institutional all at once. Alaric, a Gothic leader who had served within the Roman military world, became one of the central figures in the Western crisis after Theodosius. His followers wanted recognition, security, supplies, and a stable place within or beside the empire. For years, Alaric moved through negotiation, pressure, and conflict with Roman authorities, especially in the Balkans and later Italy. He was not simply an invader from outside the world of Rome. He was a product of the Roman frontier system, Gothic leadership, failed settlement, imperial military need, and the uncertain rewards promised to armed groups in Roman service. Stilicho worked to hold the Western Empire together under Honorius, fighting or negotiating with Alaric, managing court politics, and responding to pressures in Gaul, Britain, and Italy. His position was powerful enough to breed suspicion. In a court society where ancestry, loyalty, military force, and access to the young emperor mattered intensely, a successful general could appear both indispensable and dangerous. This had been true in the late Republic and remained true in late Empire, though the uniforms, titles, and religious language had changed. The Western court's move to Ravenna in 402 reflected the practical anxieties of the age. Milan had been useful because it was closer to the northern frontiers than Rome, but Ravenna offered marshy defensibility, access to the Adriatic, and a setting easier to protect from sudden attack. The choice said little flattering about the security of Italy. It also showed, again, that Roman power could preserve itself by moving into less splendid but more defensible forms. Rome remained a sacred city of memory. Ravenna became a place where survival could be administered. Meanwhile, pressure across the Rhine and in the western provinces grew harder to contain. Groups described as Vandals, Alans, Sueves, and others crossed into Gaul in the early 5th century, while Roman authority in Britain weakened and local defense became more uncertain. These movements were not one coordinated storm, and each group had its own history, leadership, and pressures. Yet, from the perspective of the Western court, they formed a widening loss of control. The tax base, recruiting ground, and administrative reach of the West began to shrink in ways no ceremony could easily hide. The difference between East and West grew more consequential. The Eastern court at Constantinople had richer provinces, stronger fiscal structures, and a defensible capital with access to major trade routes. The West possessed old prestige and important lands, but it faced deeper military dependency and a more fragile revenue base. This was not yet the end of the Western Empire, and no one living in 400 CE could see 476 as an inevitable date waiting ahead. But the imbalance was real. One half of the Roman world was better placed to absorb shocks that weakened the other. Christian Empire did not remove the old Roman habits of law, hierarchy, and command. It reoriented them. Bishops sat near courts, councils argued doctrine, emperors legislated religion, and aristocrats endowed churches while still cherishing family rank and public office. Soldiers of Gothic, Frankish, Vandal, Roman, and other backgrounds served under imperial titles. Cities still collected taxes, repaired walls, staged ceremonies, and negotiated privileges. The Roman world remained dense with forms, even as those forms carried new contents. By the beginning of the 5th century, the empire had become a Christian, court-centered, militarized, divided Roman order whose western half depended increasingly on generals, negotiated barbarian service, and shrinking resources. Its story cannot be reduced to faith replacing politics or barbarians replacing Romans. The change was more woven than that. Bishops, soldiers, emperors, migrants, taxpayers, aristocrats, and provincial communities all inhabited the same late Roman fabric, pulling it in different directions while still using the names and offices of Rome. The world of Augustus would have found much of this strange. Bishops correcting emperors, Gothic leaders bargaining for commands, courts in Ravenna and Constantinople, theological formulas written into law, and frontier peoples settled inside imperial territory as armed partners. Yet the older Roman habit remained visible beneath it all. Under pressure, Rome adjusted its institutions, changed its language, moved its centers, and claimed continuity. The empire had become less classical, less senatorial, and less securely Western. It had not ceased to be Roman. The West's deep dependency on generals and its shrinking resources finally made the unthinkable possible, transforming a complex political bargaining process with federate armies into the final symbolic humiliation of the city of Rome itself. Chapter 12. The Western Empire comes to rest. The sack of Rome in 410 CE did not end the Roman Empire, but it changed the emotional map of the Roman world. For 8 centuries, since the Gallic entry into the city remembered from the early Republic, Rome had not been taken by a foreign army. The old capital was no longer the usual residence of emperors, and its military value had diminished beside Milan, Ravenna, Trier, and Constantinople. Yet its name carried a weight no other city could replace. When Alaric and his Goths entered it, the event mattered not because Roman government stopped, but because Roman confidence had to make room for an image it had long treated as almost impossible. Alaric had not arrived from nowhere. He belonged to the world made by the Gothic settlement after Adrianople, by Theodosius' use of Gothic soldiers, and by the uncertain rewards offered to armed groups inside imperial politics. His followers had served, fought, negotiated, waited, and pressed for recognition within a Roman order that needed their strength but could not always decide how to place them. After Theodosius' death, as Eastern and Western courts drew apart, Alaric's position became more dangerous and more useful at the same time. He could threaten, but he could also be bargained with, and for years Roman policy moved between those two facts. Honorius, the Western emperor, ruled from Ravenna, a city whose marshes, waterways, and access to the Adriatic made it safer than Rome from sudden attack. Ravenna was not grand in the old Roman manner, but it was defensible, and that quality mattered more than memory when armies moved through Italy. The shift from Rome to Ravenna reveals the late Western Empire with unusual clarity. Prestige remained in one place, survival in another, and the government chose survival while still speaking in the language of ancient prestige. Stilicho had tried to hold the Western system together before the sack. As master of soldiers, guardian of Honorius' court, and commander of mixed Roman and barbarian forces, he stood in the long Roman line of powerful generals who became necessary enough to be feared. He fought Alaric, negotiated with him, and attempted to manage crises in Italy, Gaul, and the wider western provinces. His ancestry, ambition, and authority made him vulnerable at court, and in 408 he was executed after accusations of treachery gathered around him. The West removed one of the few men capable of managing its military dangers, and the consequences settled quickly. After Stilicho's fall, thousands connected with barbarian soldiers in Roman service were alienated or harmed, and many found their way to Alaric. The Western court's fear had weakened its own resources. Alaric pressed for land, payment, and office, demands that were not strange in late Roman politics, where military service and settlement had long been tied to negotiation. Honorius' government refused, delayed, conceded, withdrew, and misread the danger. The conflict that followed was less a simple invasion than a failed bargain inside a system that had grown dependent on bargains. Rome endured sieges before it was entered. The city's food supply, tied to sea routes and African grain, had always been one of its practical vulnerabilities beneath ceremonial grandeur. During blockade, hunger mattered more than speeches, and the Senate had to negotiate under pressures that showed how little the old aristocratic dignity could do without military force. Alaric even raised a rival emperor, Priscus Attalus, for a time, trying to use Roman forms against the Ravenna court. That gesture is telling. Even in rebellion against Honorius, politics still sought legitimacy through Roman titles. In August 410, Alaric's forces entered Rome. Ancient Christian and pagan writers alike struggled to interpret the event, and later memory often made it larger and more final than it was. The sack lasted only a few days, and Rome's churches, according to some accounts, offered refuge. Yet the violence, loss, and humiliation were real, and the symbolic force was immense. Jerome, far away in Bethlehem, wrote in grief-struck language about the city that had taken the world being taken itself, while Augustine, in North Africa, began to answer those who blamed Christianity for Rome's misfortunes. Augustine's answer became The City of God, a work much larger than the immediate crisis that helped call it forth. He did not deny Rome's importance, but he refused to let any earthly city, even Rome, carry the final weight of human hope. This was one of the intellectual turns of the late empire. Roman history, once capable of presenting itself as the story of order brought to the world, now had to be placed inside Christian time, where earthly power was temporary by nature. The empire remained politically real, but its meaning had changed in the minds of those who wrote about it most deeply. Alaric did not long survive the sack. He moved south, perhaps intending to cross to Africa, but died later in 410. His followers eventually settled in Gaul, and under later leaders the Visigothic kingdom would take shape within the Western imperial world before becoming something more independent. The Western court survived him. Honorius continued to rule, laws continued to be issued, officials continued to hold office, and coins continued to carry imperial claims. Catastrophe had occurred, but administration went on. Galla Placidia, half-sister of Honorius and daughter of Theodosius I, moved through these years with a life that joined imperial and Gothic politics in one human thread. She was taken during Alaric's entry into Rome and later married Ataulf, Alaric's successor, in a union that carried both captivity and diplomacy inside it. After Atulf's death and her return to Roman hands, she married the general Constantius, who briefly became co-emperor as Constantius III. Through these marriages, movements, and returns, Galla Placidia's life shows the late Western Empire not as a clean line between Roman and barbarian, but as a world of hostages, alliances, households, and titles crossing one another. As regent for her young son Valentinian III, Galla Placidia governed in an age when imperial women could carry dynastic continuity while generals held much of the armed power. Ravenna, where her patronage left churches and mosaics, became one of the West's last centers of imperial ceremony. The surfaces of its buildings, with gold, glass, blue depth, crosses, apostles, and imperial Christian imagery, belonged to a Roman world that had changed its visual language. Marble forums and triumphal columns had not disappeared from memory, but salvation, saints, and heavenly order now stood close to imperial legitimacy. The western provinces, meanwhile, were slipping into new arrangements. Britain had largely passed beyond effective imperial control in the early 5th century, left to local defense and local rulers whose records grow thin. In Gaul, Roman authority contended with Visigoths, Burgundians, Franks, local aristocrats, and military commanders whose loyalties could be layered and shifting. In Spain, Vandals, Sueves, and Alans established themselves before some moved onward. The imperial map did not change all at once. It frayed region by region, with treaties, settlements, campaigns, and local accommodations softening the meaning of Roman rule before ending it. North Africa mattered more than any symbolic loss in Italy. The African provinces supplied grain and tax revenue vital to the Western government, and Carthage remained one of the great cities of the Latin-speaking world. When the Vandals under Gaiseric crossed from Spain into Africa in 429 and took Carthage in 439, the West lost more than land. It lost a fiscal foundation. Armies required pay, courts required revenue, and diplomacy required gifts. Without Africa, the Western Empire's ability to recover became much narrower. Gaiseric's Vandal kingdom was not a passing raid. It possessed ships, controlled rich provinces, and could intervene across the Mediterranean with a mobility the Western court struggled to answer. The loss also weakened Rome's food supply and placed a major Roman region under a ruler outside imperial command. The old empire had often survived symbolic humiliation because its tax base remained broad. Now the material base was breaking. A government can endure wounded pride more easily than empty treasuries. Aetius became the dominant Western general in the middle of the 5th century, and his career belonged to the same world of negotiated power that had shaped Stilicho before him. As a young man, he had spent time among the Huns, and he understood the politics of peoples beyond the imperial frontier from within experience rather than rumor alone. He maneuvered among court factions, rival generals, Hunnic power, Gothic settlements, and the fragile authority of Valentinian III. Like many late Roman commanders, he served an empire whose survival depended on relationships that earlier Roman pride might have preferred not to need. Attila's rise among the Huns changed the balance of fear in Europe. The Hunnic world drew tribute, pressure, and alliance into a wide field stretching across and beyond the Danube regions, and both Eastern and Western courts had to respond to it. Attila negotiated, threatened, demanded, and campaigned with an authority that made him one of the most powerful figures of the age. The Roman Empire had always dealt with strong peoples beyond its borders, but Hunnic mobility and political force gave those dealings a sharper urgency. In 451, Attila invaded Gaul, and Aetius gathered a coalition that included Roman forces and Visigoths under Theodoric I. The battle, usually called the Catalonian Plains, or Chalons, did not produce a simple final victory over the Huns, but it checked Attila's movement in Gaul and revealed the late Western military order in its truest form. Roman survival depended on alliance with peoples who were partly inside and partly outside imperial command. Theodoric died in the fighting, and the Visigoths remained essential to the outcome. Rome was still present, but it was no longer able to stand alone in the old imperial manner. Attila invaded Italy the following year. Cities in the north suffered, and the Western court faced another crisis on Italian soil. Pope Leo I met Attila in 452. An encounter later Christian memory enlarged into a scene of spiritual authority confronting worldly force. The political circumstances included supply problems, disease, diplomacy, and Eastern pressure, as well as Leo's mission. Still, the memory of the meeting mattered because it placed a bishop where older Roman memory might have placed a general or senator. In the West, ecclesiastical authority was becoming one of the institutions that could remain visible when imperial command weakened. Attila died in 453, and Hunnic power fragmented soon after, but the West did not regain strength from his disappearance. Valentinian III murdered Aetius in 454, removing the general who had done the most to sustain his reign. The next year, Valentinian himself was killed. The pattern was wearyingly familiar. The imperial court feared powerful commanders. Powerful commanders were indispensable, and their removal often left the state weaker than before. The late Roman West repeatedly acted against the men on whom it depended, because dependence itself had become politically intolerable. In 455, the Vandals entered Rome. This second sack of the century was connected to dynastic dispute, broken marriage arrangements, and Gaiseric's capacity to project naval power into Italy. The event was deeply humiliating, and treasures were carried away. But again, the administrative meaning lay beyond the city's suffering. The Western Empire could not protect the old capital from a sea power based in what had once been its own African provinces. The Mediterranean, once held by Roman fleets and Roman grain routes, had become a space in which a successor kingdom could move with confidence. After Valentinian III, Western emperors rose and fell with increasing speed. Petronius Maximus, Avitus, Majorian, Libius Severus, Anthemius, Olybrius, Glycerius, Julius Nepos, and Romulus Augustulus belonged to a line whose names often carried less power than the generals and kingmakers around them. Ricimer, of mixed Suevic and Gothic ancestry, became the decisive military figure behind several emperors, unable or unwilling to take the imperial title himself, but strong enough to make and unmake those who did. His position shows the strange late Western separation between legitimate office and effective command. Majorian, who ruled from 457 to 461, deserves more than a passing mention because he represented one of the last serious attempts to restore Western power. He campaigned in Gaul and Spain, issued laws against abuses, tried to protect municipal life and public buildings, and prepared an expedition against the Vandals. When that fleet was destroyed or lost before it could achieve its purpose, the chance to recover Africa faded. Majorian was soon deposed and killed under Ricimer's authority. His failure was not a failure of imagination alone. The Western Empire no longer had enough secure resources to make recovery likely. The laws of these late emperors still sound Roman. They speak of taxes, curial obligations, military desertion, church privilege, public buildings, inheritance, and the duties of officials. This continuity matters. The Western Empire did not spend its last decades announcing that it had become something else. It issued commands, appointed officers, minted coins, addressed abuses, and used the language of eternal Roman order even as its effective territory contracted. Governments often speak most firmly in inherited phrases when the world beneath them is becoming difficult to hold. Julius Nepos, appointed Western Emperor in 474 with Eastern support, held a stronger claim to legitimacy than the child who would follow him in Italy. In 475, the general Orestes forced him to flee from Italy to Dalmatia, though Nepos continued to claim the title of emperor from there until his death in 480. Orestes placed his young son Romulus on the throne, and later writers gave the boy the diminutive Augustulus, the little Augustus. The name carries an almost unbearable neatness, joining Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor in the figure of a child whose authority barely extended beyond the court that raised him. Orestes had once served Attila, and his later role in placing his son on the Western throne shows again how intertwined Roman and non-Roman careers had become. The soldiers in Italy, many of them from groups serving under treaty or expectation of settlement, demanded land. Orestes refused or could not grant it. Odoacer, a military leader commanding those forces, led the revolt against him. The issue was practical and late Roman in every way. Soldiers wanted the material security that service was supposed to bring, and the Western government could not satisfy them without undoing itself. In 476, Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. The act was not accompanied by the end of Roman life, the burning of all offices, or the disappearance of Latin speech. Odoacer spared the boy and sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople, indicating that no separate Western emperor was needed and that he would govern Italy under a form of recognition from the Eastern emperor. The gesture was restrained, almost administrative. A line of Western emperors had ended not with a world-consuming catastrophe, but with the removal of an office that had already lost much of its substance. Julius Nepos still lived in Dalmatia, and for a few years his claim complicated the neatness of 476. This is worth remembering because history often prefers dates cleaner than the lives they summarize. The deposition of Romulus Augustulus became the conventional marker for the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but contemporaries could still recognize other claims, other continuities, and the enduring authority of the emperor in Constantinople. The Roman Empire did not vanish from the Eastern Mediterranean. What ended in 476 was the Western imperial court in Italy as a functioning line of rule. Odoacer governed Italy as king, but he preserved much of the Roman administrative structure. Senators remained important, Roman law continued to operate, taxes were collected, and the language of imperial legitimacy did not disappear. The old aristocracy adjusted, as aristocracies often do, to the ruler who could protect property and order. The change was real, but it was not a simple replacement of Roman life by something wholly foreign. It was a transfer of command into a new political form, resting on many Roman habits. Across the former Western provinces, similar mixtures took shape. Visigothic, Burgundian, Frankish, Vandal, and later Ostrogothic powers ruled lands filled with Roman cities, bishops, landowners, tax traditions, legal practices, and Latin-speaking populations. The new kings needed Roman administrators as much as Roman aristocrats needed new protectors. Law codes were written, councils held, estates managed, and letters exchanged in a world where Roman identity remained useful even without a Western emperor. The empire had ended as a court before it ended as a civilization. The Christian Church carried much of that continuity. Bishops remained in cities when imperial officials weakened or disappeared, and their authority joined spiritual care with legal mediation, charity, diplomacy, and local leadership. A bishop could negotiate with a king, protect property, organize relief, and preserve records. This was not the Roman state under another name, but it inherited some of the public weight that the Roman state had once held more securely. In the West, the city did not always keep an emperor's officer, but it often kept a bishop. Roads remained, though maintenance varied. Aqueducts still carried water in some places and failed in others. Villas continued on certain estates, while urban life contracted elsewhere. Coins circulated, old laws were cited, Latin endured in administration and worship, and Roman titles retained prestige. A person living through these changes might not have experienced a single ending. They might have noticed a new tax collector, a different military lord, a bishop with greater influence, a city wall repaired with old stone, a court farther away, a road less safe than it had been in a grandfather's youth. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, then, was not only an event, but a thinning. The Western court lost revenue, then provinces, then military independence, then the ability to choose and sustain its own rulers. Symbols lasted longer than power, and habits lasted longer than symbols. The Senate survived Odoacer. Roman law survived the emperors who had issued it. The Latin Church survived the cities that had housed its first congregations. Even the idea of empire survived, waiting in the East and later returning in Western imaginations under other names. And so Rome's Western story comes to rest without quite disappearing. The Republic had begun with a hatred of kings and a dense love of office, law, and public memory. The empire had turned command into ceremony, then bureaucracy, then Christian monarchy, then divided court government, then fragile Western survival among generals and federate armies. By 476, the old Western office could no longer hold the world that had created it. Yet the forms it left behind continued to lie beneath the kingdoms that followed, like old paving stones under a road still used after its builders are gone. The insignia sent east by Odoacer carried the last Western claim away from Italy, but they did not carry away the Roman past. In Ravenna, mosaics still caught light in church walls. In Africa, Gaul, Spain, and Italy, landowners still counted estates through inherited measures, bishops still wrote in Latin, and legal memory still arranged the claims of families and churches. Along roads first laid for legions and officials, carts still moved when weather and safety allowed. Milestones stood with names worn by time, their letters sometimes readable, sometimes softened into the surface of the stone. The old empire had always been more than its rulers. It had been habits of measurement, taxation, building, pleading, commanding, recording, and remembering. It had been the weight of a title on a coin, the authority of a seal, the expectation that a road led somewhere governed, the habit of filing a petition, the use of a legal phrase whose maker had died generations before. When the Western emperor disappeared, those habits did not vanish in the same hour. They settled into new hands, unevenly, incompletely, and with much forgotten, but not with nothing carried forward. Far from Rome, the Eastern emperor still ruled from Constantinople, and in the East, the Roman name would continue along another path. But here, in the Western story, the line has reached its quiet boundary. The city that had learned to distrust kings gave its name to rulers greater than kings, and the empire that gathered the Mediterranean finally left behind kingdoms that still needed its language to explain themselves. The ending was less a closed door than a change in the material of the world. Stone remained. Law remained. Roads remained in broken length through fields and towns. Latin words remained in mouths that no longer served a Western emperor. In places where the old surface held, rain gathered in the shallow wear of wheels, cooled there, and passed slowly into the ground, leaving the road present beneath the changing sky. The journey is complete. Rest well.